I am Julian Caldwell. I am 75 years old, and yesterday I stood in the hallway of my son's $2 million mansion and listened to him and his wife plan my mental execution. They said in 2 weeks I would not even remember my own name. They thought my silence meant I was getting weak and that my age was a surrender. But an old mechanic knows exactly how to dismantle a machine piece by piece until there is nothing left. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that greed is the quickest way to ruin a family. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the foundation of my life cracked open. The autumn air in Chicago was biting, but I hardly felt it as I pulled my battered Ford F-150 into the curved driveway of my son Kendrick's house in the upscale suburbs of Oak Brook. I had been there earlier that morning to fix a leaking pipe under their kitchen sink. I spent 30 years as a commercial contractor and plumber before retiring, so whenever something broke, Kendrick never called a professional. He just called me. It was expected. I did the work for free because he was my blood. But when I got home, I realized I had left my vintage steel toolbox sitting right there on their kitchen island. I did not bother ringing the doorbell. I had a spare key that Brooke, my daughter-in-law, had reluctantly given me for emergencies. I unlocked the heavy oak door and stepped into the sprawling foyer. The house was dead quiet, the kind of quiet that feels expensive. Vaulted ceilings and marble floors that I had actually provided the down payment for when Kendrick's first tech startup went belly up 5 years ago. I wiped my work boots on the mat out of habit and walked softly down the long hallway toward the kitchen. As I approached the arched doorway, I heard voices. They were low and hushed, but the acoustics in that massive house carried every syllable perfectly. I stopped just out of sight, pressing my back against the cool painted drywall. Brooke was speaking. Her voice had that precise clinical tone she used when she was at work. She is a clinical pharmacist at a major downtown hospital. She always carried herself with an air of absolute superiority, especially around me. "It is completely untraceable, Kendrick," she was saying. "I brought the vials home in my coat pocket today. It is a very specific cocktail. Heavy on Haldol with a sustained-release benzodiazepine." I held my breath. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to remain completely still. "Are you sure about the dosage?" Kendrick asked. His voice trembled slightly, not out of guilt but out of nervous excitement. "I do not want him just acting a little sleepy, Brooke. We need a medical diagnosis. The lawyers were very clear about that. If we are going to activate the power of attorney and take control of his estate, he needs to be declared medically incompetent by a neurologist." My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. The power of attorney. A few months ago, when I was hospitalized briefly for a mild angina scare, Kendrick had pushed a stack of medical papers in front of me. He told me it was just standard hospital bureaucracy to allow him to speak to the doctors. I trusted my son. I signed the papers. I did not read the fine print. Brooke let out a soft, condescending laugh. The sound of it made my blood run cold. "Do not insult my intelligence, Kendrick. I mix chemical compounds for a living. If we slip this into his food every day for the next 14 days, it will induce severe neurological suppression. He will exhibit extreme confusion, memory loss tremors, and an inability to articulate his thoughts. It perfectly mimics the rapid onset of advanced Alzheimer's disease. By week 2, he will not even know his own name, let alone have the capacity to contest a legal document. The hospital doctors will take one look at his age and his symptoms and rubber stamp the dementia diagnosis." There was a long, agonizing pause. I waited for my son to object. I waited for the boy I had raised, the boy I had taught to throw a baseball, and the boy I had worked 16-hour shifts to put through college to tell his wife that this was insane, to tell her that she was talking about destroying his father's brain. Instead, I heard the clinking of ice in a glass. Kendrick was pouring himself a drink. "It is the only way," he said, and his words felt like a knife dragging down my spine. The old man is sitting on an $8 million commercial real estate portfolio. $8 million, Brooke. He owns that entire block of warehouses in the West Loop, and the neighborhood is gentrifying so fast, the property values are skyrocketing. And what does he do with it? Nothing. He lives in that dusty little 2-bedroom house and drives a truck that belongs in a scrapyard. I cannot wait 10 years for him to die naturally. We need the capital now to expand my company. If I miss this investment window, we will lose everything. "You will not lose anything," Brooke murmured softly. I assumed she was stepping closer to him, probably rubbing his shoulders. "We just have to be disciplined. We start the drops today. I will handle the dosing. You just play the concerned son when his mind starts to go." I stood in the hallway paralyzed. The betrayal was so absolute, so surgically precise that for a moment I felt dizzy. They were not just planning to steal my money, they were planning to steal my mind. They wanted to trap me inside my own body, drooling and confused while they liquidated the legacy I had built with my bare hands. My wife, Vivian, God rest her soul, used to warn me. She used to say, "Julian, you give that boy too much. You smooth out every bump in his road, and one day he is going to expect you to lay yourself down so he can walk over you." She was right. Vivian was always right. A primal, blinding rage surged up in my throat. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to step around that corner to grab Kendrick by the collar of his expensive imported shirt and throw him through his own kitchen window. I wanted to smash the glass. I wanted to roar. But I am an old mechanic. And a mechanic knows that brute force is what you use when you do not understand the machine. If I walked in there right now, what would happen? I would yell. They would deny it. They would hide the vial. If I called the police, what would they see? They would see an angry 75-year-old black man making wild accusations against his wealthy, white daughter-in-law who holds a prestigious medical license. They would see a concerned son calming down his erratic father. Brooke would probably tell the officers that I was already showing signs of paranoia. They would lay the groundwork for my dementia diagnosis right then and there. I had no evidence, no recording, no proof. Just the word of an old man against two respected citizens of Oakbrook. I took a slow, deep breath through my nose, forcing the anger down into a tight, dark box inside my chest. I did not need to scream. I needed a strategy. They thought they were playing a game with an old fool who did not understand the rules. But they forgot that I spent my entire life negotiating with cutthroat commercial developers and union bosses in Chicago. You do not survive 30 years in the construction business by being soft. I began to back away. I placed my work boots carefully on the hardwood floor, ensuring my rubber soles made absolutely no sound. I kept my eyes fixed on the arched doorway as I retreated down the long hallway. I reached the front door, turned the brass knob with excruciating slowness, and slipped out into the biting autumn air. I pulled the door shut until I heard the faint click of the latch. I walked down the driveway to my truck. My hands were perfectly steady. The sadness was gone, replaced by an icy, calculating clarity. I climbed into the cab of the Ford, shut the heavy door, and gripped the steering wheel. I looked at the grand house through my dusty windshield. They were inside right now, looking at my toolbox, plotting my erasure. Just as I reached for the ignition, my cell phone vibrated in the cup holder. The bright screen illuminated the dim cab of the truck. The caller ID said Brooke. I stared at the name for 3 rings. I cleared my throat, adjusting my posture, relaxing my facial muscles, even though she could not see me. I pressed the green button and brought the phone to my ear. "Hello," I said, keeping my voice warm and slightly gravelly, the perfect picture of an unsuspecting old man. Dad Brooke's voice poured through the speaker, bright and bubbling with synthetic affection. "Hi there. Kendrick just walked into the kitchen and noticed you left your toolbox on the island. You must be looking everywhere for it." "Oh, Lord," I chuckled, forcing a small sigh. "My memory is getting worse by the day, Brooke. I would lose my head if it was not attached to my neck. I was just about to turn around and come look for it." "Nonsense," Brooke insisted sweetly. "You do not need to drive all the way back out here in this traffic. I am actually heading out to run some errands anyway. I can swing by your place and drop it off." "That is too much trouble for you, sweetheart," I said, playing the script perfectly. "It is no trouble at all, Dad. Besides, I spent all morning slow cooking a fresh batch of beef stew. It is Kendrick's favorite recipe, and I packed a large container just for you. It will save you from having to cook tonight. I will be there in 20 minutes, okay?" I looked through the windshield at the house. I knew exactly what was in that stew. The first dose. The poison was on its way. "That sounds wonderful, Brooke," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly calm. "I will put a pot of coffee on for when you get here. Drive safe." I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. I turned the key and the truck's heavy engine roared to life. Let her come. They wanted to see if the old man would swallow the poison. I was going to give them exactly what they wanted, and then I was going to tear their entire world down to the studs. I sat at the small kitchen table in my modest brick bungalow and waited for the sound of her car. My house is not large or grand like the mansion I helped my son buy. It is a simple 2-bedroom place with faded wallpaper and a creaky wooden floor. But it is mine. Every scratch on the floorboards tells a story of the life Vivian and I built here. I looked up at the old grandfather clock ticking away in the corner. The pendulum swung back and forth like a heavy heartbeat. 20 minutes had passed since I spoke to Brooke on the phone. Right on schedule, I heard the crunch of gravel outside my window. The heavy engine of her luxury SUV cut off. I stood up slowly, deliberately adopting the posture of an old man whose joints ached with the weather. I walked to the front door and pulled it open just as she raised her knuckles to knock. Brooke stood on my porch holding a large plastic container. She was dressed in her crisp designer clothes, wearing a beige cashmere coat that probably cost more than my first truck. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a tight, elegant bun. She offered me a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Hi, Dad," she said, stepping inside without waiting for me to invite her. "I brought the stew just like I promised, and I brought your toolbox too. Kendrick left it in the trunk of my car." "Thank you, Brooke," I said, keeping my voice warm and slightly trembling. "That is very kind of you. You did not have to go out of your way for an old man." "Oh, it is no trouble at all," she replied, walking straight into my kitchen like she owned it. "I want to make sure you are eating properly. You live all alone in this drafty house, and Kendrick worries about your health. We both do." She set the plastic container on the counter and popped the lid off. A rich, savory smell filled the small kitchen. It smelled like beef and carrots and rosemary. It smelled like comfort, but I knew exactly what was hiding beneath the surface of that dark gravy. I knew she had meticulously measured out a cocktail of heavy sedatives and antipsychotic drugs stolen from the hospital pharmacy. Drugs designed to dissolve my memories and reduce my mind to a blank slate. "I will get you a bowl," Brooke said, opening my cupboards with practiced ease. "You should eat this while it is hot." I watched her back as she moved around my kitchen. The cat and mouse game had officially begun. She was the predator confident and entirely unaware that the mouse had already seen the trap. She poured a generous portion of the stew into a ceramic bowl and carried it over to the small table. She placed it in front of my chair and pulled out the opposite chair for herself. "Sit down, Dad," she instructed gently, but with a firm undertone. "Eat. I want to see you finish a good, warm meal." I lowered myself into the wooden chair, letting out a soft sigh as if my back was giving me trouble. I picked up the heavy silver spoon. Brooke sat across from me, crossing her legs and resting her chin on her hands. Her pale blue eyes locked onto me. She was watching me like a hawk. I could see the clinical calculation in her gaze. She was a pharmacist observing a clinical trial. She was waiting to confirm that the subject had ingested the experimental dose. I looked down at the steaming broth. The smell was overpowering now. I needed to get this liquid into a container and take it to a lab, but I could not simply refuse to eat. If I pushed the bowl away, she would know something was wrong. If I told her I would eat it later, she would insist on waiting. I had to make her believe I swallowed the poison. I stirred the stew with my spoon, buying a few seconds of time. I have spent my entire life working with plumbing and water systems. I know how liquids move. I know how pressure builds and how to redirect a flow. Right now, I needed to redirect the flow of this deadly broth. "It smells absolutely wonderful, Brooke," I said, offering her a grateful smile. "You are a fantastic cook. Kendrick is a lucky man." "Just eat, Dad," she said, her smile tightening at the edges, "before it gets cold." I scooped up a large spoonful of the thick, dark gravy along with a piece of tender beef. I brought the spoon up toward my mouth. Brooke leaned forward slightly. Her eyes widened just a fraction in anticipation. She needed to see it go past my lips. Just as the edge of the spoon touched my bottom lip, I drew in a sudden, sharp breath. I forced the air down the wrong pipe, intentionally triggering a violent spasm in my throat. I coughed. It was a loud, hacking, explosive cough that shook my entire chest. "Oh my goodness," I gasped violently, jerking my hand forward. The heavy silver spoon twisted in my grip. I let it slip, deliberately spilling the dark, greasy stew straight down the front of my light gray flannel shirt. The hot liquid soaked instantly into the fabric, leaving a massive dark stain. I continued to cough heavily, pressing my hand against my chest, playing the role of the clumsy, frail old man choking on his own breath. Dad, Brooke said, sitting back quickly to avoid the splash. "Are you okay?" I nodded, waving my hand in the air while I wheezed. "Just swallowed wrong," I managed to croak out. "Oh, look at what I have done. I am making a mess of myself." I stood up quickly, grabbing the ceramic bowl from the table with my left hand and clutching my stained shirt with my right. I kept coughing, my face turning red from the genuine physical effort of faking the fit. "I need to wash this off before it sets," I mumbled hurriedly, walking toward the hallway. "I will be right back, Brooke. Just give me a second." I did not wait for her to answer. I hustled down the short hallway and ducked into the bathroom, kicking the door shut behind me with my heel. I immediately flipped the lock. The loud click echoed in the small tiled room. The moment the door was locked, the coughing stopped completely. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, breathing quietly, perfectly calm. I looked at my reflection. My eyes were sharp and cold. I had about 60 seconds before she started getting suspicious. I set the bowl of poison stew on the edge of the porcelain sink. I opened the medicine cabinet above the sink. My hands moved quickly and precisely without a single tremor. I reached all the way to the back of the top shelf and pulled out an empty amber prescription bottle. I had saved it months ago after finishing a round of antibiotics. I unscrewed the white plastic child-proof cap. I picked up the ceramic bowl. Carefully angling the rim, I poured the thick dark broth into the narrow mouth of the pill bottle. The liquid filled the small plastic cylinder almost to the brim. I stopped pouring just before it overflowed. I screwed the white cap back on as tightly as it would go and shoved the amber bottle deep into my leather shaving kit on the shelf. There was still about half a bowl of stew left. I could not bring it back out. She had to believe I consumed a large portion. I turned toward the toilet. I dumped the remaining contents of the bowl straight into the toilet bowl. I reached over and pressed the silver handle. The loud rush of water echoed through the plumbing, flushing the dark, heavy liquid away into the city sewer system. Then I turned on the sink faucet, letting the water run loudly. I grabbed a wet washcloth and scrubbed at the large brown stain on my flannel shirt, making sure it looked like I had been actively trying to clean myself up. "Are you all right in there, Dad?" Brooke called out from the hallway. Her voice was slightly muffled through the heavy wooden door, but I could hear the sharp edge of impatience in her tone. "I am fine, sweetheart," I called back, raising my voice to sound slightly embarrassed. "Just making a mess like a clumsy old fool. I will be right out." I turned off the faucet. I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand, leaving a small trace of moisture on my chin. I picked up the empty ceramic bowl. I unlocked the door and pulled it open, stepping back out into the hallway. Brooke was standing a few feet away, her arms crossed over her chest. Her eyes darted immediately to the empty bowl in my hand. I held it up, offering a sheepish grin. "I am so sorry, Brooke," I said. I was so hungry that while I was standing over the sink scrubbing my shirt, I just slurped the rest of it right out of the bowl. It was absolutely delicious. Best stew I have had in years. Brooke stared at my face. She looked at the wet stain on my shirt. She looked at the empty bowl. She was analyzing the variables, calculating whether I was telling the truth. I kept my face entirely relaxed, projecting nothing but innocent gratitude. I knew she wanted to believe her plan was working. Arrogance is a dangerous blind spot, and Brooke was incredibly arrogant. She wanted to believe she had won. A slow, satisfied smirk finally crept onto her lips. "I am glad you liked it, Dad," she said, her voice returning to that sickeningly sweet tone. "You need your strength." She walked over to me, took the empty bowl from my hands, and carried it back to the kitchen to pack it away. I followed her, moving at a slow, shuffling pace. "Well, I should get going," she said, picking up her keys from the counter. "Kendrick is waiting for me at home. I will make sure to bring you more food later this week. You just rest and take it easy, okay?" "I will do that, Brooke," I said, walking her to the front door. "Thank you again." I watched her walk down the porch steps and get into her luxury car. I stood in the doorway and waved as she backed out of the driveway. I kept a pleasant, gentle smile on my face until her car disappeared around the corner at the end of the block. The moment she was out of sight, my smile vanished. The charade was over. I turned back inside and locked the deadbolt. I walked straight to the bathroom and pulled the amber pill bottle from my shaving kit. The dark, heavy liquid sloshed inside the plastic cylinder. I slipped the bottle into the deep pocket of my heavy canvas work jacket. I could not take this sample to my regular doctor. I could not go to the Northwestern Hospital System or any major clinic in the Chicago area. Brooke was a senior clinical pharmacist. She was connected. She had access to the medical network databases. If my name popped up in a hospital system requesting a toxicology screen for heavy sedatives, she would receive an alert or hear about it through her colleagues. She would know immediately that I was onto them, and they would destroy the remaining drugs and deny everything. I needed a place that did not ask questions. I needed a place that did not accept insurance, did not require a social security number, and did not put records on a digital cloud. I needed the underground. I grabbed my truck keys from the kitchen counter. I walked out the back door and climbed into my battered Ford truck. The engine roared to life with a familiar gritty growl. I backed out of my quiet suburban driveway and turned the steering wheel heading south. I drove past the manicured lawns and the upscale shopping centers of Oakbrook. I got onto the highway and merged into the heavy afternoon traffic. I watched the city skyline rise in the distance, a jagged wall of steel and glass against the gray sky. I was heading to the south side of Chicago. I spent my youth working construction jobs in the roughest neighborhoods in the city. I knew the alleys, the back streets, and the hidden corners where the official rules did not apply. I knew a private cash-only medical lab operating out of an old industrial building near the rail yards. They catered to people who needed absolute privacy and did not care about the law. As I drove, the landscape slowly changed. The shiny high-rises faded away, replaced by crumbling brick warehouses, chain-link fences, and the heavy rumble of freight trains. The streets grew narrower and darker. I gripped the leather steering wheel tightly, feeling the calluses on my palms. Kendrick thought I was just a tired old man waiting to fade away into the background. He thought he could inject his poison into my life, and I would just quietly go to sleep. But he forgot who raised him. He forgot that before I was an old man in a flannel shirt, I was a man who built skyscrapers from the ground up. I knew how to pour a foundation, and I knew how to rig explosives to bring a building down. I reached into my pocket and felt the hard plastic of the pill bottle. The evidence was right there in my hand. The cat and mouse game was over. It was time to start the hunt. I parked my truck in the underground garage of the towering glass skyscraper in downtown Chicago. The rain was still beating against the concrete outside, but down here it was perfectly quiet. I took the private elevator up to the 42nd floor. The doors opened to a sprawling office suite with marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gray waters of Lake Michigan. This was the domain of Marcus Vance. He was not the kind of lawyer you hired to negotiate a friendly settlement. He was the kind of lawyer you hired when you wanted to completely obliterate your enemies and salt the earth where they stood. The receptionist did not ask me to wait. She took one look at my canvas jacket and heavy work boots and immediately pressed a button on her desk. Marcus had clearly given orders. The heavy oak doors at the end of the hall swung open. Marcus stood there in a dark blue bespoke suit. He was a tall man with sharp eyes and silver hair. He had represented me for over 20 years. He knew how much I was worth, and he knew I did not waste time. "Julian," he said, walking forward and extending his hand. "Come in." I shook his hand and walked into his office. It was immaculate. No family photos, no golf trophies, just rows of legal texts and a massive mahogany desk. I did not sit down. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the folded toxicology report from the underground lab. I tossed it onto the polished surface of his desk. "Read it," I said. Marcus picked up the paper. His eyes scanned the chemical compounds and the lethal dosage warnings. He did not gasp. He did not ask stupid questions. He simply set the paper back down and looked at me. "Who is trying to poison you, Julian?" he asked, his voice perfectly calm. "My son Kendrick and his wife Brooke," I replied. "She stole the drugs from her hospital. They are trying to induce rapid onset dementia. Once a doctor declares me mentally incompetent, they plan to activate the general power of attorney I signed last year. Kendrick wants to liquidate the West Loop warehouse properties to fund his failing company." Marcus leaned back against the edge of his desk. He crossed his arms. The silence in the room was heavy. I could see the gears turning in his head. He was already analyzing the angles, the liabilities, and the potential for legal destruction. "Attempted murder is a police matter, Julian," he said slowly. "Why are you in my office instead of speaking to a homicide detective?" "Because the police will bungle it," I said. "Brooke is a senior pharmacist. She knows how to manipulate the medical narrative. If I go to the cops right now, she will claim I am hallucinating. She will say I mixed the drugs myself in a fit of dementia. They will brush it off as an elderly man losing his mind. I will not let her control the story. Kendrick wants the real estate. I want to let him try to take it. And when he reaches for it, I want you to chop his hand off at the wrist." A slow, cold smile spread across the face of my lawyer. "What exactly do you want to do, Julian?" "I want to set up an irrevocable blind trust," I said. "I want it named the Vivian Caldwell Trust after my late wife. I want every single commercial asset I own, every warehouse, every empty lot, and every bank account transferred into that trust immediately. I want myself listed as the primary beneficiary, but I want the control of the assets handed over to an independent corporate trustee, someone Kendrick cannot manipulate or bribe." Marcus nodded slowly, walking behind his desk. "An irrevocable trust. Once you sign those papers, the assets no longer belong to you legally. They belong to the trust. The power of attorney Kendrick holds only applies to your personal assets. If he tries to use that document to sell the commercial properties, he will be selling something he does not own. He will be committing massive federal fraud." "Exactly," I said. "I want them to step right into a federal trap." Marcus sat down in his high-backed leather chair. He opened a drawer and pulled out a thick legal pad. He picked up a gold fountain pen. "But there is a massive risk here, Julian. A legal vulnerability that we have to address right now." "Explain it," I said, taking a seat in the heavy leather chair opposite his desk. If we draft this trust today and transfer $8 million worth of real estate into it, Kendrick will eventually find out. When the buyer tries to run the title search, they will see the properties belong to the Vivian Caldwell Trust. Kendrick will realize his power of attorney is useless. He will panic. But he has a medical background through his wife. If he realizes what you did, he will hire aggressive litigation attorneys to strike back. And what will they argue? I asked, keeping my eyes locked on his. They will argue that you were already mentally incompetent when you signed the trust documents today, Marcus said, leaning forward. They will use the fact that you have been acting confused. They will use whatever Dr. Brooke bribes to say you were already suffering from severe dementia this very afternoon. They will petition a judge to invalidate the trust, claiming I took advantage of a sick old man. If the judge agrees the trust is dissolved, the assets revert back to you, and Kendrick uses the power of attorney to take everything. I stared at Marcus. The room was quiet except for the rain hitting the glass. I understood the danger perfectly. They were going to use my own trap against me. They were going to say I was crazy before the trap was even set. They would turn my own defense into their weapon. So how do we stop them from doing that? I asked. We cannot stop them from trying, Marcus said. But we can build an absolute fortress around this trust. I am going to have 3 independent medical experts come to this office within the next hour. A neurologist, a psychiatrist, and a geriatric specialist. They are going to examine you top to bottom. They are going to administer cognitive tests on camera. They are going to sign sworn affidavits stating that as of this exact date and time, Julian Caldwell is of completely sound mind with 0 cognitive impairment. We will attach those affidavits to the trust documents. It will be an ironclad medical record. I nodded slowly. Do it. Call them right now. But there is one more thing, Julian, Marcus said, his voice dropping lower. And this is the part that requires absolute discipline. Once we file these papers, the trap is set. But the trap only works if Kendrick actually commits the crime. He needs to believe he has the power to sell those buildings. He needs to believe his poison is working perfectly. He needs to feel completely invincible. I know, I said, feeling the cold weight of the reality settling into my bones. Marcus looked at me very seriously, setting his gold pen down on the desk. You cannot just act slightly forgetful, Julian. You have to sell it. You have to convince a highly trained pharmacist that your brain is actively rotting away. You have to act so completely incompetent that they feel completely safe moving forward with the sale. You have to let them treat you like garbage. You have to let them take your dignity. You have to become the pathetic, helpless victim they want you to be. Are you prepared to do that? I looked out the large window at the dark city below. I thought about the 30 years I spent building my legacy. I thought about the freezing winters I spent pouring concrete and the boiling summers I spent welding steel. I thought about Vivian and the sacrifices we made. And I thought about the vial of poison sitting in my daughter-in-law's expensive cashmere coat pocket right now. They wanted to erase my mind. They wanted to turn me into a ghost in my own life. I am not an actor, Marcus, I said softly, turning my gaze back to him. I am a mechanic. I know how to let a machine break down so I can see exactly which parts are defective. I will give them the performance of a lifetime. I will let them think they have destroyed me. I will let them push me into the dirt. And when they are standing at the finish line counting their money, we will drop the sky on their heads. Marcus smiled a cold predator smile. I will make the calls. I sat in that office for 4 solid hours. 3 different medical specialists arrived one after the other. They asked me questions about my childhood, about the current president, about the dates and times. They tested my short-term memory by asking me to repeat sequences of numbers backwards. They tested my reflexes and my logic. A camera on a tripod recorded every single second of the examinations. I answered every question with cold, sharp precision. I did not stumble once. When they were finished, they signed the legal affidavits. Marcus drafted the irrevocable trust documents quickly and flawlessly. He slid the thick stack of papers across the desk toward me. I picked up the gold pen. I signed my name on every single line using the exact architectural script I had used my entire life. The letters were perfectly straight and sharp. The ink dried, the assets were moved, the trap was armed and locked into place. As I left the office and rode the private elevator back down to the underground garage, I felt a strange new sense of peace. The initial shock and the burning anger were completely gone. I got back into my battered truck and turned the key in the ignition. The engine rumbled to life, echoing off the concrete walls. Now the real work began. It was time to go back to my empty house and start losing my mind. I spent the next 3 days pouring Brooke's expensive poison down my kitchen sink. Every afternoon, like clockwork, she would stop by with a new plastic container. Sometimes it was a heavy beef stew. Sometimes it was a rich chicken casserole. The food always smelled delicious, but I knew the thick sauces were hiding a chemical cocktail designed to destroy my brain. I would open the front door and thank her with a tired smile. I would take the container walk into the kitchen, and the moment her luxury SUV backed out of my driveway, I would dump the contents straight down the drain. I watched the dark sludge spiral away into the pipes, washing away their murder weapon. But I knew simply avoiding the poison was not enough. I had to show them the results they were expecting. I had to become the ghost they wanted me to be. I began the physical transformation immediately. I stopped shaving. I let the gray stubble grow out rough and patchy on my jawline, making me look neglected. I stopped buttoning my shirts correctly. I would leave the top 2 buttons undone and misalign the rest so the fabric hung crooked on my frame. I took the framed photographs of Vivian and me from the living room mantel and turned them face down on the wood as if looking at them caused me confusion. I turned on a single burner on the kitchen stove, leaving it clicking loudly without ever lighting the gas. I had to set the perfect stage for my son. I had to build a theater of decay. On Thursday afternoon, the theater opened its doors. I heard the heavy thud of a car door closing in the driveway. It was not Brooke this time. I looked through the dusty front window and saw Kendrick. He was wearing a sharp gray suit that I had probably paid for indirectly by covering his massive debts over the years. He was coming to inspect his work. He was coming to see if his father's mind had finally melted down from the drugs. I did not lock the front door. I stood in the middle of the living room holding a faded couch cushion in one hand and looking around the space with a blank, empty stare. The brass handle of the front door turned. The door swung open and Kendrick walked in. His expensive leather shoes clicked sharply against the old hardwood floor. He stopped in the entryway, taking in the scene. "Dad," he called out. His voice carried a fake layer of concern. The kind of voice a salesman uses when he is trying to pretend he cares about your problems. "Are you here?" I turned around slowly. I let my shoulders slump forward, simulating the heavy weight of old age. I made my eyes wide and unfocused. I looked at him not like a father looks at a son, but like a stranger trying to read a blurry street sign in a foreign country. "I cannot find them," I whispered. I made sure my voice trembled just a little bit. "I cannot find the keys to the truck. I need to go to the hardware store right now." Kendrick stopped walking. He looked at my crooked flannel shirt. He looked at the unlit stove clicking endlessly in the kitchen. He looked at the couch cushion I was clutching to my chest like a shield. I watched his eyes closely. I expected to see a flash of guilt. I expected to see a moment of hesitation or shame in a son who was witnessing his father crumble into nothing. But there was absolutely no guilt. His eyes lit up. A subtle hungry spark ignited in his dark pupils. He thought the heavy sedatives and the antipsychotic drugs were working perfectly. He thought the chemical lobotomy was taking hold. He thought he had won the game. "Dad," he said, dropping his voice into a slow, condescending rhythm. It was the exact tone you would use to speak to a confused toddler. "You do not need to go to the hardware store today. You are retired, remember? You do not work anymore." I shook my head stubbornly, holding the cushion tighter. "No, I need the keys. Vivian asked me to fix the back gate. The wood is rotting. I need to buy new hinges before the rain starts. Have you seen my keys, Andre?" The name dropped into the quiet living room like a heavy stone. Andre was my firstborn son. He was Kendrick's older brother. Andre passed away from leukemia when he was only 12 years old. Kendrick was just a baby when it happened. I had not spoken Andre's name out loud in over a decade because the pain of losing my boy was still too sharp in my chest. But I knew that confusing my living son with my dead son was the ultimate red flag of advanced cognitive decline. It was a calculated strike designed to convince Kendrick that my reality was fractured. Kendrick froze completely. He stared at me with his mouth slightly open. He took a slow step closer, scanning my face for any sign that I was playing a joke. But I kept my expression entirely vacant. I blinked slowly, looking past his shoulder toward the empty hallway. "Did you see my keys, Andre?" I asked again, letting a note of rising panic creep into my frail voice. "The hardware store closes at 5 o'clock. Your mother will be so upset with me if I do not fix that gate today. You know how she gets." Kendrick swallowed hard. He reached up and rubbed his chin to hide his expression. I could see him struggling to contain a massive smile. It was sickening to witness. He was thrilled that his father was losing his mind. He was celebrating the destruction of my memories. "It is me, Dad," he said, stepping closer and placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. "It is Kendrick. Andre is not here, and Mom has been gone for 5 years. Remember, we buried her at the church." I let out a soft, confused gasp. I dropped the cushion onto the floor. I brought my trembling hands up to my face and rubbed my eyes roughly. No, that is not right," I muttered, shaking my head from side to side. "I just saw her. I just saw Vivian. She was right there in the kitchen making coffee." Kendrick patted my shoulder. His touch made my skin crawl. Every protective instinct, every ounce of pride in my body screamed at me to stand up straight, grab him by the throat and throw him through the front window. I wanted to drop the act and show him exactly how sharp my mind still was. I wanted to tell him about Marcus the lawyer and the irrevocable trust. I wanted to tell him that he was walking blindfolded into a federal trap that would ruin his life forever. But I remembered the toxicology report. I remembered Brooke smiling with her cold blue eyes as she handed me a bowl of poison. They did not deserve a warning. They did not deserve mercy. They deserved the full, devastating weight of the consequences they had engineered. So I swallowed my pride. I swallowed the burning anger in my throat. I let my knees buckle slightly, forcing him to catch me. I leaned heavily against the back of the sofa, breathing hard. "Why do we not sit down?" Dad Kendrick suggested, guiding me toward my old, worn-out recliner. "You look completely exhausted. Have you been sleeping at all?" I let him guide me across the room. I sat down heavily in the fabric chair, staring blankly at the black screen of the television. "I am not sleeping well," I mumbled, staring at nothing. "My head is cloudy. Everything feels like it is moving too fast, Kendrick. The walls feel like they are spinning. I cannot keep track of the days anymore." "Brooke said you might be feeling a little under the weather," he said, taking a seat on the very edge of the sofa facing me. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees to look me in the eyes. "She said you seemed very confused when she dropped off your food yesterday. We are really worried about you, Dad. We hate seeing you struggle like this." I nodded slowly, letting a single tear form in the corner of my eye and roll down my rough cheek. It was not a fake tear. It was a real tear born out of the profound, heartbreaking grief of realizing my son was a monster. "I just feel so tired," I whispered. "I feel like I am losing my grip." Kendrick leaned in even closer. His expensive cologne filled the space between us. It smelled like the millions of dollars he was desperate to steal. "I know, Dad," he said, his voice smooth and incredibly reassuring. "It is hard getting older. Managing this big house, paying the utility bills, taking care of the commercial properties downtown, it is way too much responsibility for you right now. Your brain needs to rest. You need to let me take care of the heavy lifting. You took care of me my whole life. Now it is my turn to take care of you." I looked at him with wide, vulnerable eyes, playing the role of the desperate old man perfectly. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. "What are you going to do?" Kendrick reached into the inside breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a thick, folded stack of legal documents. He smoothed the heavy white papers out on the wooden coffee table right in front of me. The top page had a bold black heading printed across the top: General Power of Attorney. "It is just some standard paperwork, Dad," he lied without blinking. "It is exactly like the hospital forms you signed last year, but this one just lets me handle the bank stuff for a little while. Just until you feel better and get your strength back. I can pay your utility bills for you. I can make sure your taxes are filed properly with the state. You will not have to worry about a single thing. You can just sit here and relax." I stared at the papers. I knew exactly what they were. This single document would give Kendrick absolute legal control over my personal finances, my medical decisions, and my legal rights. If I had not locked the commercial real estate inside the Vivian Caldwell Trust 3 days ago, signing this paper would have handed him the keys to my $8 million empire. He thought he was closing the trap around my neck. He had absolutely no idea he was stepping onto a massive landmine. "I do not know, Kendrick," I stammered, pretending to be completely overwhelmed by the dense paragraphs of legal jargon on the page. "My eyes cannot focus on the words today. They are all blurry. What does all this legal stuff mean?" Kendrick let out an exaggerated sigh, acting like a patient teacher dealing with a very slow student. "It means I am trying to help you, Dad. The bank requires this specific form so I can write checks to buy your groceries. If you do not sign it, the city might shut off your water and electricity because you keep forgetting to pay the bills. You do not want to live in the dark without water, do you?" He was using pure fear. He was threatening me with poverty and discomfort to force my hand. It was the lowest, most pathetic form of manipulation. No, no, I do not want that, I said, shrinking back deep into the cushions of the recliner. I do not want the lights to go out. Kendrick smiled. It was a cold, victorious, deeply greedy smile. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a sleek silver pen. He clicked the top button with his thumb. Then he reached across the coffee table and pressed the cold metal pen firmly into my trembling right hand. Good, he said softly, his eyes locking onto mine. Then all you have to do is sign your name right here on the bottom line, and I promise I will take care of the rest. I looked down at the silver pen resting in my hand. I looked up at the son I had raised. He was waiting for the final piece of his puzzle. He was waiting for me to hand over my life. I adjusted my grip on the pen, preparing to give him exactly what he asked for. I started to shake. Not just a little tremble, but a violent, uncontrollable tremor that started in my shoulder and traveled all the way down to my fingertips. The heavy silver pen rattled against the wooden coffee table. Kendrick put his hand over mine, trying to steady it. "Just sign it, Dad," he whispered, his voice tight with impatience. "Just put your name right there on the line. I promise everything will be taken care of. You just need to write your name." I let out a weak, pathetic groan. I dragged the pen across the thick white paper. My real signature is a thing of beauty. After 30 years of signing off on architectural blueprints and multi-million-dollar contractor agreements, my true signature is a series of sharp, precise geometric angles. It is a bold statement of identity that is registered with every major federal bank in the Midwest. It is the signature of a man who builds things that last. But the signature I put on that general power of attorney looked like it was drawn by a confused, frightened child. I made the loops wide and incredibly sloppy. I pressed too hard in some places and too light in others. I deliberately misspelled my own last name, leaving out the letter D and writing an E instead of an A. The ink smeared heavily across the page as I dragged the side of my palm over the wet letters. It was a pathetic, worthless scribble. But to Kendrick, it was the absolute keys to the kingdom. The moment the pen lifted from the paper, the atmosphere in the room completely shattered. The caring son routine evaporated into thin air like water thrown onto a hot skillet. Kendrick did not gently take the document from the table. He snatched it. He ripped it right out from under my hand so fast it gave me a paper cut on my knuckle. He stood up immediately, his posture changing from a concerned caregiver to a towering, arrogant tyrant. He looked down at the smeared signature and a cold, cruel laugh escaped his lips. The sound of that laugh hit me harder than any physical blow ever could. I sat back in my recliner, keeping my mouth open slightly, my eyes wide and frightened. "What is it, Kendrick?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Did I do it right? Are the bank people going to be happy?" He did not answer me right away. He folded the heavy document carefully, ensuring the ink was dry, and slipped it into the inside breast pocket of his expensive tailored suit. He patted the pocket flat against his chest. Then he looked down at me, and the look in his eyes was pure, unadulterated contempt. There was no love left in his gaze. There was no respect. There was only the cold, calculating look of a thief who had just cracked a safe. "You really have no idea what is going on, do you, old man?" he said. His voice was no longer warm or soothing. It was like a sharp ice pick chipping away at a frozen windshield. It was brutal and raw. I shrank back deeper into the fabric of the chair, pulling my arms close to my chest. "I am just tired," I mumbled, looking away from him. "I just need to sleep for a little while." "You are pathetic," Kendrick spat, stepping closer so he was towering directly over me, casting a dark shadow over my face. "You have been pathetic for years. Sitting in this rotting house driving that embarrassing piece of garbage truck while you hoard millions of dollars in commercial real estate downtown. You sat on an absolute gold mine while my company was drowning. I had to beg investors for pennies. I had to humiliate myself in boardroom meetings while my own father had an $8 million portfolio just sitting there collecting dust doing absolutely nothing. I let my hand shake in my lap. I looked up at him with watery eyes. "You are my son," I whispered. "I provided for you, Kendrick. I gave you everything you needed." "You provided the bare minimum," Kendrick yelled, his face turning a dark shade of red. "You made me feel like a charity case every single time I needed a loan. You worked yourself to the bone your whole life, and for what? So you could live like a peasant in a neighborhood that nobody cares about. Brooke was entirely right about you. You are just a stubborn, ignorant old fool who does not understand how the real world works anymore. Money is meant to be used, Dad. It is meant to be leveraged. But you are just a dragon sleeping on a pile of gold. You are a burden, a heavy, useless burden to everyone around you." I listened to every single word. I did not interrupt him. I did not try to defend myself or explain the value of hard work and patience. I let him pour all of his toxic resentment out into the open air. He was giving me the final confirmation I needed. The last tiny, fragile piece of my heart that still loved him as a son finally turned to stone right then and there. He was not my family anymore. He was just a parasite standing in my living room trying to bleed me dry. Well, you do not have to worry about the properties anymore. Kendrick continued, smoothing the lapels of his jacket and adjusting his expensive silk tie. I am taking over completely. I am going to sell those warehouses to a tech firm out of Silicon Valley. They are going to build a massive data center right where your dirty little workshops used to be. I am going to use your hoarded wealth to actually build something that matters for the future, and you are going to sit here and slowly forget your own name. He turned around and walked toward the front door. He did not ask if I needed a glass of water. He did not ask if I needed help getting out of the heavy recliner. He just grabbed the brass handle of the front door and pulled it open, letting the cold afternoon air sweep into the house. "I will send someone to check on you later," he called out over his shoulder, not even bothering to look back at me. "Try not to wander off into the street, old man. I do not have time to come looking for you." The door slammed shut behind him, rattling the frame. The house fell completely silent. I sat perfectly still for 60 seconds, listening to the sound of his luxury SUV starting up in the driveway. The moment I heard his tires roll off the concrete and onto the street, the violent tremors in my hands completely stopped. My spine straightened out, pressing firmly against the back of the chair. I closed my mouth and took a deep, steady breath through my nose. I reached up and calmly wiped a small bead of sweat from my forehead. The performance was over for now. I stood up from the recliner, moving with perfect balance and quiet strength. I walked over to the front window, pulled back the dusty curtain just a fraction of an inch, and watched his car disappear down the street. He had the paper. He thought he had the absolute power. He had absolutely no idea that the signature he just forced me to write was entirely legally void. Even if I had not created the irrevocable trust with Marcus 3 days ago, the federal banks would have flagged that sloppy, childlike signature as fraudulent the second he tried to submit it. But with the trust firmly in place, he was essentially holding a blank piece of paper and preparing to commit massive federal wire fraud with it. He was walking straight toward a prison cell with a smile on his face. I walked into the kitchen and turned off the stove burner that I had left clicking for the last hour. I poured myself a cup of black coffee from the pot I had brewed earlier. My mind was sharp and clear. I knew the next phase of the plan was approaching, but I expected it to happen slowly over the next few days. I expected Kendrick to go to the bank first thing Monday morning to try and initiate the transfer of the commercial properties. I expected him to leave me alone in this house to slowly rot while Brooks' drugs supposedly took their permanent toll on my brain. I severely underestimated how ruthless Brooke and Kendrick really were. They were not going to leave me in the house. They wanted me entirely removed from the equation immediately so I could not accidentally ruin their plans or speak to a neighbor. I sat at the small wooden kitchen table sipping my hot coffee and reviewing my mental timeline. I needed to call Marcus and Elias, my old construction foreman, to set up the surveillance for the next few days. I reached for the cheap burner phone hidden deep in my canvas jacket pocket. Suddenly, a massive explosive crash shook the entire front of the house. I jumped up from the table, the hot coffee spilling over the rim of the mug and burning my hand. The sound was deafening, like a tree trunk smashing straight through the wood. I dropped the mug in the sink, ran out of the kitchen, and hurried into the living room. The heavy wooden front door had been kicked open with such violent force that the brass deadbolt had completely ripped out of the doorframe. Splinters of jagged wood and twisted metal were scattered across the entryway floor. Standing in my house were two massive, burly men in matching dark gray industrial jumpsuits. They did not look like medical professionals. They did not look like social workers or nurses. They looked like enforcers at a rough underground nightclub. They stepped over the broken wood and walked straight into my living room, their heavy, steel-toed boots tracking dark mud over my clean floorboards. I immediately dropped back into my character. I let my knees weaken, causing me to stumble backwards slightly, and I brought my trembling hands up to my chest in fake absolute terror. "Who are you?" I stammered, my voice pitching high and thin like a frightened child. "What are you doing in my house? You broke my door." The larger of the two men, a guy with a thick bull-like neck and a shaved head, pulled a folded piece of white paper from his pocket. He did not look sympathetic at all. He looked incredibly annoyed to be there. "Julian Caldwell," he asked, barking my name like a military order. "Yes," I whispered, taking another small, shaky step back toward the wall. The bald man unfolded the paper and held it up in the dim light of the room. I recognized it immediately. It was a photocopy of the general power of attorney Kendrick had just stolen from me. The ink was probably still wet on the original sitting in Kendrick's pocket. Your son, Kendrick Caldwell, has assumed full legal guardianship over your medical and living arrangements, the man recited in a bored, flat, monotone voice as if he had read this exact speech 100 times before. He has determined in consultation with medical professionals that this property is no longer safe for a person in your rapidly declining mental condition. What does that mean? I asked, letting my hands shake violently again, hugging my arms around myself. It means you do not live here anymore, old man, the second guy said, stepping forward aggressively and pulling a heavy black plastic trash bag from his back pocket. He tossed it onto my wooden coffee table with a loud slap. You have exactly 10 minutes to pack a single bag of clothes, the bald man said, crossing his massive tree trunk arms over his broad chest. Do not bother packing valuables, cash, or electronics. You will not be allowed to keep them where you are going. Where am I going? I asked, playing the frightened, helpless victim perfectly, even as my sharp mind raced to calculate this dangerous new variable. You are moving to Pine Haven, the man grunted, taking a step toward me to enforce his threat. And if you do not pack your bag right now, we are going to pack it for you, and you will not like how we do it. So get moving right now. I sat in the back of the unmarked gray van. The two massive men in industrial jumpsuits sat up front. They did not speak to me. They treated me like a piece of broken furniture they were hauling to the dump. I looked out the tinted window as we drove out of Oakbrook and headed toward the industrial outskirts of the city. We were not going to a luxury retirement community. Kendrick would never spend a dime of my money on my comfort. He wanted to maximize his profit. We pulled up to a sprawling one-story brick building surrounded by a high chain-link fence. The faded sign near the road said, Pine Haven Care Center. It did not look like a haven. It looked like a prison. The bald man opened the sliding door of the van and grabbed my arm. He pulled me out onto the cracked asphalt. The air smelled like exhaust fumes and damp earth. They marched me through the sliding glass front doors. The lobby was dimly lit and smelled heavily of industrial bleach and old stale soup. A receptionist sat behind a thick sheet of plexiglass. She barely looked up as the two men handed her a thick manila envelope. The paperwork is all there, the bald man said. The son has full medical guardianship. The daughter-in-law is a pharmacist at Northwestern. She signed off on the transfer protocol. He needs to go straight to the locked memory care ward. The receptionist nodded and pressed a buzzer under her desk. A heavy metal door down the hallway clicked open. Two nurses walked out. They were wearing faded blue scrubs and looked completely exhausted. One of them was a tall woman with severe features. She walked up to me and grabbed my shoulder with a firm clinical grip. Come along, Julian, she said, her voice loud and patronizing as if she were speaking to a deaf child. We are going to get you settled in your new room. I let my shoulders slump. I kept my eyes wide and unfocused. I shuffled my feet, dragging my heavy work boots across the linoleum floor. They led me down a long, fluorescent-lit corridor. We stopped in front of a second set of heavy doors. These doors had magnetic locks and keypad entry systems. There were no handles on the inside. This was the point of no return. The nurse punched in a 4-digit code and pushed the door open. We stepped into the memory care unit. The atmosphere changed instantly. The air was thicker and warmer. An old woman was sitting in a wheelchair near the wall, staring blankly at a television that was not turned on. A man in a hospital gown was pacing back and forth, muttering under his breath. This was the waiting room for death. This was the place where families hid their burdens. The severe nurse led me into a small, sterile room with a single narrow bed. Strip down, Julian, she ordered. We need to get you into a facility gown and inventory your personal belongings. I hesitated, pretending to be confused and frightened. I do not want to take my clothes off, I mumbled, clutching the collar of my flannel shirt. I want to go home. I need to fix my back gate. The nurse sighed heavily. It was the sigh of a woman who was overworked, underpaid, and entirely stripped of her empathy. She reached forward and began unbuttoning my shirt herself. You do not live there anymore, Julian. This is your home now. Just cooperate and everything will be fine. I allowed her to strip off my heavy canvas jacket and my flannel shirt. I watched as she ruthlessly emptied my pockets. She took the cheap burner phone I had bought. She took my worn leather wallet. She took the keys to my truck and my house. She placed everything into a clear plastic bag and sealed it shut. She handed me a thin, scratchy hospital gown covered in faded blue geometric patterns. Put this on, she commanded. Dinner is in 1 hour. If you cause trouble, we will restrain you to the bed. She turned and walked out of the room. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind her. I heard the lock engage from the outside. I stood alone in the center of the small room holding the cheap gown. I dropped the helpless old man act immediately. My spine straightened out, my eyes sharpened. I quickly dressed myself in the scratchy fabric tying the strings behind my back. I walked over to the single small window. The glass was reinforced with wire mesh. It looked out over a barren courtyard surrounded by a high concrete wall. Kendrick and Brooke had executed their plan flawlessly. They had used the forged power of attorney to completely strip me of my identity. In the eyes of the law and the medical system, I was no longer a wealthy commercial contractor. I was a helpless dementia patient trapped in a locked facility with zero rights. They had taken my money, my phone, my clothes, and my freedom. They thought they had buried me alive. I spent the next hour pacing the small room, memorizing the layout. I examined the hinges on the door. I inspected the ventilation grate near the ceiling. I noted the structural weaknesses of the building. I had spent 30 years building facilities just like this one. I knew the electrical grids. I knew the plumbing systems. I knew exactly how corners were cut by cheap contractors. Pine Haven was a dilapidated structure, held together by peeling paint and administrative neglect. A loud buzzer echoed down the hallway. A few moments later, the lock on my door clicked open. A different nurse, a younger man with a bored expression, stuck his head inside. "Dinner time, Julian," he said. "Follow the yellow line on the floor to the cafeteria. Do not wander off." I hunched my shoulders forward, letting my jaw go slack. I shuffled out into the hallway, joining a slow-moving procession of elderly men and women. The smell of boiled vegetables and mystery meat filled the air. We walked into a large, open cafeteria filled with long, folding tables and plastic chairs. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered constantly, giving the room a sickly green glow. I picked up a plastic tray and stood in line. A tired cafeteria worker scooped a pile of gray mashed potatoes and boiled peas onto my plate. I took my tray and walked to a table in the corner, sitting down alone. I looked around the room. It was absolute chaos. Some patients were crying silently. Others were arguing with invisible people. The nurses stood around the perimeter, chatting among themselves, ignoring the misery unfolding right in front of them. This was absolute isolation. I could scream that I was a millionaire. I could tell them that my son had forged my signature. I could beg them to call my corporate lawyer. And every single person in this room would simply nod patronizingly and write it down as a symptom of my advancing dementia. There was no phone I could reach. There was no door I could open. The trap Kendrick built was incredibly effective. I picked up my plastic spoon and stared at the gray food. I knew Brooke had likely sent specific medical directives to the staff here. She probably scheduled daily doses of the chemical cocktail to maintain my supposed mental decline. I would have to be incredibly careful about everything I ingested. I would have to use every ounce of my willpower to survive this sterile hell. As I sat there calculating my next move, the double doors leading to the kitchen swung open. A janitor walked out pushing a large yellow mop bucket. The wheels of the bucket squeaked loudly over the linoleum floor. He was an African-American man in his early 60s wearing a faded gray jumpsuit. He kept his head down, pushing a heavy wet mop rhythmically across the dirty tiles. He moved slowly and methodically, cleaning the area near the serving line. Then he began to work his way across the cafeteria floor, weaving between the tables. The nurses ignored him. The patients ignored him. He was completely invisible, just another underpaid worker in a forgotten place. He pushed his mop bucket closer to my corner table. He swiped the wet mop back and forth across the floor near my feet. He did not look up. He kept his eyes locked on the dirty linoleum. He pushed the bucket so it bumped gently against the leg of my plastic chair. He leaned forward, resting his weight on the wooden mop handle. He turned his head slightly so his face was hidden from the nurses standing across the room. "Boss," he whispered. His voice was incredibly low and rough. I did not jump. I did not turn my head to look at him. I kept my eyes fixed entirely on my plate of gray food. I slowly brought a spoonful of potatoes toward my mouth. "It is me," the janitor whispered again, swiping the mop around the back of my chair. I knew exactly who it was. The rough, gravelly voice was unmistakable. It was Elias. Elias was my lead construction foreman for 25 years. We had poured concrete together, built skyscrapers together, and buried friends together. He was a man made of iron and loyalty. When I realized Brooke and Kendrick were trying to poison me and commit federal fraud, I knew I would need a man on the inside of whatever facility they tried to throw me into. 3 days ago, right after I signed the irrevocable trust with Marcus, I had called Elias. I told him what my son was planning. I told him I needed someone to infiltrate Pine Haven. Elias did not hesitate. He forged a resume, walked into the Pine Haven administrative office the very next morning, and applied for the lowest-paying janitorial job they had. The facility was desperate for cheap labor, and they hired him on the spot. I lowered my spoon. I stared blankly at the wall, playing my part perfectly for the cameras and the nurses. "I am here, Elias," I whispered back, my lips barely moving. Elias squeezed the mop handle. "I got the burner phone in my locker." He murmured, his voice blending with the squeak of the bucket wheels. "The night shift nurses sleep at the desk after midnight. I will slip the phone under your door at 1 in the morning. Be ready." "I will be ready," I breathed. "What about the paperwork?" "I broke into the administrative office during my shift this afternoon," Elias whispered, pushing the mop away from the table. "Brooke sent over a special prescription file for you. She wants them to dose you heavy starting tomorrow." "Then we move fast," I whispered. Elias nodded once, keeping his head down. He pulled the yellow bucket away from my table and moved toward the center of the cafeteria, completely blending back into the background. I picked up my plastic spoon and took a bite of the terrible food. The hospital gown was cold against my skin. The room was loud and chaotic. Kendrick and Brooke thought they had thrown me into an inescapable black hole. They thought they had severed my connection to the outside world completely, but they forgot the golden rule of building any structure. You never leave a master mechanic alone inside a building you want to keep standing, because he knows exactly which load-bearing walls to knock down. I was locked inside Pinehaven, but the countdown to their destruction had just begun. I kept my eyes on my plastic plate as Elias pushed his yellow mop bucket past my chair. The cafeteria was a chorus of miserable sounds, but right in my small corner of the room, there was only the squeak of rubber wheels and the wet slap of the mop. Elias bumped the bucket against the metal leg of my table. It was a perfectly calculated accident. As he leaned over to steady the bucket, his large, calloused hand brushed against the fabric of my hospital gown. I felt a small, heavy rectangular object slide smoothly into the deep side pocket of the gown. "Excuse me, boss," Elias muttered, his voice blending perfectly into the background noise. I did not look at him. I simply kept my hand resting over the pocket, feeling the hard plastic outline of the burner phone. Elias turned and pushed his bucket away, disappearing into the crowd of nurses and wandering patients. He was a ghost in this machine, and he had just handed me the detonator. The rest of the evening was an exercise in extreme patience. The nurses herded us back to our small, sterile rooms. The severe woman from earlier grabbed my arm and guided me down the long, fluorescent hallway. The lights buzzed overhead with a sickening hum that made my teeth ache. They locked me inside my room at exactly 8 o'clock. The heavy click of the deadbolt echoing down the corridor was supposed to be the sound of my absolute defeat. Instead, it was the sound of my office door closing so I could finally get to work. I sat on the edge of the narrow, uncomfortable bed and listened to the rhythm of the ward. I needed to understand the schedule of the night staff before I made my move. I spent 30 years analyzing blueprints and project timelines. Every system has a pattern, and every pattern has a blind spot. By 10 o'clock, the chaotic noises of the memory care unit began to die down. The crying stopped. The television down the hall was turned off. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling and listening to the footsteps outside my door. The night nurse was a heavy-set man who wore rubber clogs. I could hear the distinct squeak of his shoes as he walked his route. He did an hourly bed check, stopping at every door and shining a small flashlight through the reinforced wire mesh window to make sure the patients were in their beds. He checked my room at midnight. The beam of the flashlight swept across my closed eyes. I kept my breathing slow and even, playing the part of the heavily sedated old man. The light clicked off, and the squeaking shoes moved down the hallway. I had exactly 55 minutes before his next round. I sat up quietly and swung my legs over the side of the bed. The hospital gown was thin and offered no warmth against the chill of the room. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the burner phone. It was a cheap black brick with physical buttons. The screen was cracked, but it had a full battery and a prepaid cellular signal. I slipped off the bed and walked into the tiny attached bathroom. It was a cramped space with a metal toilet and a small ceramic sink. I closed the bathroom door, leaving it open just a fraction of an inch so I could hear the hallway. I turned the sink faucet on, letting a thin stream of cold water run down the drain. The gentle splashing sound would help mask my voice. I crouched down on the cold tile floor, hiding in the darkest corner of the bathroom. I dialed the number for Marcus Vance entirely from memory. I pressed the phone to my ear. It rang 3 times before the lawyer answered. Vance speaking, Marcus said, his voice sharp and alert even in the middle of the night. "It is Julian," I whispered, keeping my voice as low as possible. "I am inside Pinehaven. Elias made contact and got me the phone. What is our status?" Julian, Marcus replied, and I could hear the relief and the adrenaline in his tone. "I have been monitoring Kendrick and his financial movements all week. You were right. The second they dropped you off at that facility, he went straight to work. He thinks the power of attorney gives him absolute control. He has completely taken over your personal checking accounts. He paid off Brooks' credit cards and transferred $50,000 into his failing company account just this morning. Let him take the cash, I whispered, watching the crack in the bathroom door. That is just petty theft. What about the commercial real estate? What about the West Loop warehouses? That is where the situation escalates, Marcus said. The tone of his voice grew incredibly serious. Kendrick is not just trying to take out a loan against the properties, Julian. He is liquidating the entire portfolio. He signed a preliminary sale agreement yesterday afternoon. Who is the buyer? I asked, gripping the small plastic phone tighter. It is a massive data center corporation out of Silicon Valley, Marcus explained. They have been looking to buy up industrial blocks in Chicago for their new server farms. Kendrick bypassed the local real estate brokers and went straight to their corporate acquisition team. They offered him a fast cash buyout to close the deal quickly. $8.5 million, Julian. They want the land, and they want to demolish the warehouses by the end of the month. A cold wave of anger washed over me. Kendrick was not just stealing my money, he was going to bulldoze 30 years of my sweat and blood so he could buy himself a comfortable life. He wanted to erase my legacy completely. He signed the preliminary agreement using the forged power of attorney I asked, confirming the trap was armed. Yes, Marcus said. He submitted the fraudulent document to their legal team. They accepted it because they are eager to close, and they believe you are medically incapacitated. But Julian, a preliminary agreement is not enough for the federal authorities to drop the hammer. It shows intent, but a clever defense lawyer could still argue that Kendrick was just exploring his options and planned to consult you before the final sale. If we want to lock him in a federal prison for a decade, we need him to sign the final closing documents. We need him to authorize the actual wire transfer of that $8.5 million across state lines. When is the closing date? I asked. Marcus paused for a second. That is the bomb, Julian. The closing date is this Friday morning at 9 o'clock. They are meeting in the boardroom of the buyer's legal representatives downtown. That is exactly 4 days from now. 4 days. I had to survive 4 days inside this locked ward, avoiding the heavy sedatives Brooke had prescribed for me while maintaining the illusion that my mind was completely gone. Suddenly, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was the distinct squeak of rubber clogs down the hallway. The night nurse was early. I had lost track of time. The footsteps were getting louder, approaching my door. Hold on, I whispered sharply into the phone. I lowered the phone and pressed my thumb against the speaker. I stood up quickly, my joints aching from the cold floor. I moved to the toilet and unrolled a long strip of scratchy toilet paper, dropping it into the bowl. The squeaking footsteps stopped right outside my room. I saw the beam of the flashlight sweep across the dark bedroom, hitting the empty bed. I immediately reached out and pressed the metal handle of the toilet. The loud rushing sound of the flush echoed loudly in the small tiled bathroom. I groaned softly, pretending to be an old man struggling in the middle of the night. I walked out of the bathroom, my head down, shuffling my feet. I squinted against the harsh beam of the flashlight coming through the door window. Go back to bed, Julian, the night nurse called out through the heavy door. His voice was bored and irritated. I nodded slowly, keeping my eyes half closed. I shuffled back to the narrow bed and climbed under the thin blanket. I pulled the covers up to my chin and closed my eyes. The flashlight lingered on my face for a few agonizing seconds, testing to see if I was fully asleep. Finally, the light clicked off and the heavy rubber shoes squeaked away down the corridor, fading into the distance. I waited 2 full minutes before I moved. I pulled the burner phone from beneath the blanket and brought it back to my ear. I am still here, I whispered. That was close, Marcus noted. Too close. Julian, you cannot stay in there until Friday. Brooke is a pharmacist. I intercepted a medical directive she sent to the Pine Haven administration this afternoon. She instructed them to put you on a specialized heavy dosage protocol starting tomorrow morning. She is trying to chemically restrain you so you cannot cause any problems before the sale goes through. If they force those pills down your throat, you will not be able to think straight, let alone execute our plan. I have Elias on the inside, I told him, my mind racing to adapt to the timeline. He's going to help me swap the pills. I just need to play the part until Thursday night. And then what Marcus asked. And then I break out of this prison. I said, my voice cold and hard. I need you to contact the Federal Bureau of Investigation, White Collar Crime Division. You tell them you have undeniable proof of an $8 million wire fraud conspiracy. You send them the toxicology report and the camera footage of Brooke stealing the drugs. You tell them the exact location and time of the closing meeting on Friday morning. The federal agents will not raid a corporate law firm based on a phone call from an attorney, Marcus warned. They will want the victim present. They will want you in the room, Julian. I will be there, I promised, staring into the dark corner of my sterile room. You just make sure the agents are waiting outside those boardroom doors. Kendrick wants to sell my empire. I am going to let him sit at the head of the table. I am going to let him hold the pen. And right before the ink dries, I am going to walk through those doors and burn his entire life to the ground. I will have everything ready, Marcus said. Watch your back, Julian. They are playing for keeps. So am I, I replied. I ended the call and slipped the black plastic phone deep inside the mattress cover, pushing it into the foam where the nurses would not feel it during a routine sheet change. I lay back on the uncomfortable bed staring up at the ceiling. 4 days. 4 days of playing the pathetic victim. 4 days of dodging poison. I closed my eyes, letting the cold anger settle deep in my chest. Kendrick thought he had buried me. He did not realize he had just planted a seed and the harvest was going to be absolutely devastating. The morning light in Pine Haven was always a sickly shade of gray. It filtered through the reinforced wire mesh of my small window, offering absolutely no warmth. I sat on the edge of my narrow, uncomfortable bed and stared at the blank painted wall. Today was Wednesday. Tomorrow night I would escape this place, but today I had to survive my daughter-in-law. I knew Brooke was coming. Marcus had warned me about her new medical directive. She was bringing the final massive dose. It was the heavy chemical cocktail meant to shut down my vocal cords and leave me completely catatonic before the multi-million-dollar real estate sale on Friday morning. I walked into the cafeteria for breakfast, keeping my head down and my shoulders hunched to maintain the illusion of a broken man. I sat at my usual table in the far corner. The noise in the room was unbearable, but I tuned it out. Elias was already there, pushing his yellow mop bucket across the faded linoleum. He moved closer to my table, working methodically. As he wiped down the plastic surface of the table next to mine, he dropped a small folded paper napkin directly onto my tray. I did not look up. I simply slid the napkin into the deep pocket of my hospital gown. Inside the paper were 4 small white breath mints. They were the exact size and shape of standard pharmaceutical tablets. Elias had done his job perfectly. Now I had to do mine. I went back to the common room and sat in a vinyl armchair facing the television. I reached into my pocket and felt the smooth, hard surface of the mints. I palmed 2 of them, slipping them carefully between the webbing of my middle and ring fingers. When I was 19 years old, I was drafted into the Army and deployed overseas. I do not talk much about those days because war changes a man in ways that polite society does not want to hear about. But the Army taught me much more than how to clean a rifle. It taught me how to survive when the enemy was looking right at your face. An old supply sergeant from Detroit taught me a sleight of hand trick to hide extra rations during strict barracks inspections. You do not hide the object in your palm. You hide it between the fingers and you use misdirection. You make the observer focus entirely on the movement of the wrist so they completely miss the stillness of the fingers. I had not practiced the trick in 50 years, but muscle memory is a powerful and permanent thing. I rolled the mints across my knuckles under the loose fabric of the hospital gown. I was ready for her. Just before the lunch hour, the heavy magnetic doors of the memory care unit clicked open loudly. Brooke walked in. She looked completely out of place in her tailored beige suit and expensive leather boots. She carried a sleek designer handbag and an orange prescription bottle. She walked straight to the main nurse's station. I watched her from the corner of my eye. She was smiling broadly, speaking softly to the severe nurse who had admitted me 2 days ago. Brooke played the part of the exhausted but loving family member with sickening perfection. She handed the orange bottle to the nurse, tapping her manicured finger against the warning label. She was giving them the final instructions. She was telling them to obliterate my mind. The severe nurse nodded and poured a tiny paper cup of water. She opened the orange bottle and shook out 2 thick white pills into a second paper cup. Brooke turned and looked across the room. Her pale blue eyes locked directly onto me. She whispered something to the nurse, and they both began walking toward my vinyl chair. I let my head loll heavily to the side. I let my jaw hang completely slack. I let a thin string of drool form at the corner of my mouth. Brooke stood over me, looking down with absolute disgust, disguised poorly as pity. "Hello, Dad," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweet syrup. "You look so tired today. We brought you some new medicine to help you rest. It will make all the bad feelings go away, so you do not have to worry anymore." I blinked slowly, looking at her with blank, empty eyes. I reached up with a trembling hand to wipe my mouth. The 2 white breath mints were safely tucked between my fingers, hidden entirely from her view. The nurse stepped forward, holding out the small paper cup containing the real poison. "Open up, Julian," she ordered in her loud, patronizing tone. "It is time to take your pills." I let my hand shake violently as I reached out for the cup. I pinched the rim of the paper cup between my thumb and index finger. I brought the cup slowly toward my mouth. Brooke leaned in much closer. She wanted to see the pills touch my tongue. She needed to verify the execution with her own eyes. I tipped the cup back. At the exact same moment, I coughed lightly, bringing my other hand up to cover my mouth. It was a fluid, seamless motion perfected decades ago in a humid jungle. The real pills fell from the cup directly into the palm of my covering hand while my fingers pushed the 2 white breath mints past my lips and onto my tongue. I swallowed hard, taking the cup of water from the nurse and drinking it down greedily. I lowered my hands, dropping the real pills deep into the hidden pocket of my gown. Brooke was not satisfied. "Open your mouth, Dad," she said softly, but firmly, stepping right into my personal space. "Lift your tongue up for me." I did exactly as she asked. I opened my mouth wide and lifted my tongue. The oral cavity was completely empty. The mints were gone down my throat. The real pills were safe in my pocket. The observer saw exactly what she desperately wanted to see. A slow, sickening smile spread across Brooke's face. Her eyes lit up with pure, arrogant victory. She looked at the nurse and nodded in approval. "He is being so cooperative today," Brooke said, turning her back on me. "Make sure he gets this exact dose every morning and every evening without fail. He should be completely sedated by tomorrow morning. Kendrick and I just want him to be peaceful during this difficult transition." The nurse agreed, and they walked away, leaving me alone in the vinyl chair. I closed my eyes, leaning back against the cheap cushion. My heart was pounding steadily in my chest. The predator had watched the prey spring the trap and walked away thinking she had caught her meal. She had absolutely no idea she had just swallowed a heavy iron hook. The afternoon dragged on with agonizing slowness. I stayed in my chair, staring at the television screen without seeing the moving pictures. I played the part of the heavily drugged catatonic patient. I did not speak a single word. I did not move a muscle when the nurses walked by my chair. I let my breathing grow shallow and slow. By 4:00, the shift change happened. The cafeteria doors opened for the early dinner service. I shuffled down the hallway, my head bowed and my shoulders slumped heavily. I took my plastic tray and sat at my table in the far corner. A few minutes later, Elias appeared. He was pushing the heavy yellow mop bucket again. He moved methodically across the floor, wiping up spilled juice and dropped food. He worked his way over to my corner. He bumped the bucket against the leg of the table adjacent to mine. He leaned heavily on the wooden handle, keeping his broad back to the room. "Boss," he whispered, his voice tighter and much lower than before. I did not look at him. I stared at my tray of cold food. I asked him quietly if he had managed to dispose of the real pills without anyone seeing him. "I got them," Elias whispered, swiping the mop slowly. I slipped them into the industrial trash compactor out back. "They are completely gone." "But Julian, I have terrible news. I broke into the administrative office during the chaotic shift change. I wanted to see the exact medical directives Brooke put in your official facility file. I picked the lock on the main filing cabinet. I asked him what he found, feeling a sudden cold knot form in the pit of my stomach. Elias hesitated for a fraction of a second. I could hear the deep anger vibrating in his chest. "It is not just heavy sedatives, Julian. They are not just trying to keep you quiet for the real estate sale on Friday." I told Elias to tell me everything right then. "I found a legal document attached to the very front of your medical chart," Elias whispered, his voice thick with absolute disgust. "It is a do not resuscitate order. Kendrick signed it yesterday using the forged power of attorney. He legally authorized this facility to withhold all life-saving measures in the event of your cardiac or respiratory failure." The words hit me like a physical blow to the jaw. A do not resuscitate order. I understood the medical and legal implications instantly. My own son had legally ordered the medical staff to let me die. Brooke is a pharmacist. Elias continued swiping the mop back and forth with aggressive force. She knows exactly what that massive heavy dosage will do to a man your age. She knows it severely slows the heart rate and dangerously depresses the respiratory system. Julian, they are not just trying to put you to sleep. They are trying to induce a fatal heart attack. And when it happens, the nurses here are legally bound by Kendrick's signature to stand back and simply watch you die. The cold reality of my son's ultimate betrayal settled deep into my aging bones. It froze the marrow. He did not just want my money, he wanted my life. He had signed my death warrant so he could buy a faster car and build a bigger house. I felt the very last lingering shred of paternal instinct wither and turn to ash inside my chest. He was no longer my child. He was an active threat to my survival. I told Elias that we were leaving tomorrow night. I told him we were going to burn their entire world to the ground. "I am ready, boss," Elias replied, pushing the bucket away and melting back into the crowd of shuffling patients. I sat in the cold, noisy cafeteria staring at the gray food on my tray. I was 75 years old. I had survived grinding poverty in my youth. I had survived the brutality of the army. I had survived 30 years of breaking my back in the unforgiving commercial construction business. I was certainly not going to die in a sterile room surrounded by strangers just because my spoiled, arrogant son decided my time was up. I picked up my plastic spoon, gripping it tightly. I was going to let Kendrick walk into that corporate boardroom on Friday morning. I was going to let him taste the absolute peak of his victory. And then, I was going to take everything from him. Absolutely everything. The clock on the wall of my sterile room clicked past midnight. The memory care ward was completely silent except for the low mechanical hum of the heating vent. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sound of a mop bucket. Elias had told me he would bring the papers. I heard the faint squeak of rubber wheels out in the hallway. A thin shadow passed over the crack of light beneath my heavy wooden door. A folded stack of white papers slid quietly under the door frame and rested on the cheap linoleum floor. The footsteps faded away down the corridor. I sat up and swung my legs out of the bed. I picked up the papers and walked into the small bathroom, leaving the door cracked just enough to hear the hallway. I turned on the sink faucet to mask any noise and sat down on the cold tiles. I held the papers up to the dim light filtering through the crack in the door. It was a copy of my official facility medical chart. The first page was a standard intake form, but attached right to the front was a heavy legal document with a bold black heading. It was a "Do Not Resuscitate" order. My eyes scanned the dense legal paragraphs. It stated that in the event of my heart stopping or my breathing failing, the medical staff at Pinehaven were strictly forbidden from performing cardiopulmonary resuscitation. They were forbidden from using a defibrillator. They were forbidden from calling an ambulance to transfer me to an emergency room. The document was signed at the very bottom in blue ink. The signature belonged to my son, Kendrick Caldwell, acting under the forged general power of attorney. I turned the page. The second document was a specific medical directive written and authorized by Brooke in her capacity as a senior clinical pharmacist. She had outlined a palliative care protocol for me. She claimed that my advanced dementia was causing me severe physical distress and agitation. Under the guise of compassionate comfort care, she had authorized the facility to administer a heavy intravenous dose of fentanyl if my condition rapidly deteriorated. I stared at the word fentanyl printed on the white paper. I spent my life in construction. I know men who ruin their lives with that drug. It is a synthetic opioid 50 times stronger than heroin. A massive dose given to an elderly man already loaded with heavy sedatives would stop his respiratory system in a matter of minutes. The entire picture finally snapped into perfect, terrifying focus. They were not just trying to keep me quiet. They were not just trying to wait for me to die naturally in this terrible place. Kendrick was scheduled to sign the final closing documents for the $8.5 million real estate sale on Friday morning. Once that money was successfully wired into his corporate account, I would become an enormous liability. If I miraculously woke up or if someone investigated my sudden mental decline, their entire scheme would collapse and they would face decades in federal prison. The only way to guarantee they kept the money was to make sure the true owner of the properties never spoke again. Brooke was going to come to Pinehaven on Friday afternoon. She was going to use her medical credentials to access my room. She would claim I was in severe distress. She would inject the fentanyl directly into my veins. My heart would slow down and then it would stop completely. The nurses would rush in, but the "Do Not Resuscitate" order signed by Kendrick would force them to stand back and watch me take my last breath. The county coroner would look at my age, look at the fake dementia diagnosis, and rule it a natural death from old age and heart failure. They were planning an execution, a perfectly legal, clinically sterile execution. I felt a cold, heavy knot form in the center of my chest. For a brief second, the image of Kendrick as a little boy learning to ride a bicycle flashed in my mind. I buried that image instantly. That boy was dead. The man wearing his face was a monster who was actively planning my murder. I reached into the hidden pocket of my hospital gown and pulled out the cheap black burner phone. I dialed Marcus Vance. He answered on the second ring. I told Marcus everything I had just read. I told him about the do not resuscitate order and the fentanyl protocol. I kept my voice perfectly flat and calm, but I could hear Marcus take a sharp breath over the line. "This changes the entire legal landscape," Julian Marcus said, his voice tight with urgency. "We are no longer just dealing with federal wire fraud. This is conspiracy to commit premeditated murder. I am calling the federal authorities right now. We cannot wait until Friday. I am going to have them raid that facility tonight and pull you out of there." I told Marcus to stop. I explained that if the authorities raided Pine Haven tonight, Kendrick and Brooke would simply claim it was a misunderstanding. Brooke would argue the fentanyl was standard end-of-life care, and the dementia diagnosis justified the power of attorney. They had not actually stolen the money yet, and they had not actually administered the lethal injection. The authorities would have a very difficult time proving intent without the finalized financial crime to anchor the motive. Brooke and Kendrick would hire expensive lawyers post-bail and slip away. They would try again, and next time, I might not see it coming. I told Marcus we had to stick to the plan. We had to let Kendrick sign the final papers on Friday morning. That was the only way to lock the cage around them. Marcus argued with me, but I cut him off. I told him to give me the direct contact numbers for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, White Collar Crime Division, and the Drug Enforcement Administration. I needed to lay the groundwork myself. Marcus gave me the numbers. I ended the call and dialed the local field office for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. A night duty agent answered the phone. I introduced myself as Julian Caldwell. I told him I was a victim of a massive corporate real estate fraud scheme involving $8.5 million. I told him my son had forged federal documents and was closing a deal with a Silicon Valley tech firm on Friday morning. The agent listened for a moment. Then he asked me where I was calling from. I hesitated. I had to tell the truth because they could trace the call. I told him I was currently being held against my will at the Pine Haven Care Facility in the Memory Care Ward. The tone of the agent's voice changed immediately. It went from professional curiosity to exhausted patronization. He asked me if I knew what day it was. He asked me if I had taken my medication tonight. I tried to explain the situation again, detailing the trust fund and the forged power of attorney. I told him my lawyer, Marcus Vance, had the toxicology reports and the trust documents ready for their review. The agent sighed heavily into the phone. He told me that they receive dozens of calls every week from elderly patients in nursing homes who believe their families are stealing from them. He said it was a civil matter and that I should speak to the facility administrator in the morning. He told me the Federal Bureau of Investigation does not raid corporate law firms based on a midnight phone call from a memory care patient. He politely suggested I go back to sleep, and he hung up the phone. I stared at the blank screen of the burner phone. I dialed the Drug Enforcement Administration next. I asked to speak to an agent regarding a senior pharmacist stealing heavy narcotics from a downtown hospital with the intent to distribute and commit murder. I gave them Brooke's full name and her hospital identification details. The agent on duty took the information down, but his voice carried the same heavy skepticism. He told me they would open a preliminary inquiry and look into her background over the next few weeks. He told me these investigations take time to process through the proper channels. A few weeks. I did not have a few weeks. I had exactly 36 hours before my son signed the papers and my daughter-in-law drove to this facility with a needle full of fentanyl. The bureaucracy was a massive, slow-moving machine. It was designed to process paperwork, not to save an old man trapped in a locked room. Kendrick and Brooke knew exactly how the system worked. They knew the federal agencies moved like glaciers while they were moving like lightning. They had isolated me so perfectly that even when I held the truth in my hands, nobody with a badge was willing to listen to me. I put the burner phone down on the cold bathroom floor. The anger inside me solidified into something much harder and sharper than before. If the federal government was not going to come to Pine Haven to save me, then I was going to have to bring the evidence directly to their doorstep. They would not listen to a voice on a phone call from a nursing home, but they would have to listen to the legitimate owner of an $8 million portfolio standing in the middle of a corporate boardroom with an irrevocable trust document in his hand. I picked the phone back up and called Marcus one last time. He answered immediately. I told him the federal agents did not believe me. I told him they thought I was just a crazy old man having a paranoid episode in a locked ward. Marcus cursed softly under his breath. "I will drive down to the field office tomorrow morning, Julian," he said. "I will physically hand them the toxicology reports and the camera footage. I will force them to open an active case file." I told him that was good, but it was not enough. I told him the only way the feds would actually crash that closing meeting on Friday morning was if they knew the primary victim was going to be there in person to press federal charges on the spot. I needed to be in that boardroom when Kendrick picked up the pen. Marcus asked me how I was supposed to do that. He reminded me that I was locked inside a secure facility with magnetic doors guards and a heavy medical watch. I looked at the heavy "do not resuscitate" order sitting on my lap. I looked at the signature of the son who wanted me dead. I remembered the blueprints I had studied when I built facilities exactly like this one 40 years ago. I remembered the weak points, the blind spots, and the shortcuts the contractors always took. I told Marcus to have a tailored suit waiting for me. I told him to make sure the federal agents were standing by the elevators of the law firm on Friday morning. "I am breaking out of this place tomorrow night," I said, my voice echoing softly against the bathroom tiles. "I am going to walk right through their front door and I am going to take my life back." I hung up the phone. I folded the medical papers and slipped them deep inside the mattress next to the phone. I walked back into the dark room and looked out the reinforced window at the empty courtyard. The rain had started to fall again, washing the grime off the concrete walls. Kendrick thought he was at the finish line. He thought he had outsmarted his tired old father. But tomorrow night, he was going to learn that you never trap a mechanic inside a building unless you want him to tear it apart from the inside out. Thursday night arrived with a suffocating heaviness. I lay on the thin mattress in my locked room staring at the digital clock on the wall. It read 11:45. In less than 10 hours, Kendrick would walk into a downtown corporate boardroom and sign away my life. And a few hours after that, Brooke would walk into this very room with a syringe full of lethal narcotics. I had spent the last 4 days playing the part of a broken, helpless old man. I had swallowed my pride. I had let them strip me of my clothes, my name, and my dignity. I had allowed the nurses to talk down to me and handle me like a piece of defective machinery. But as the clock clicked closer to midnight, I felt the frail old man persona shed from my skin like a dead shell. I was a commercial contractor. I was a boss. And it was time to go back to work. I sat up and swung my legs off the bed. I did not put on the cheap foam slippers they had given me. I needed to feel the solid floor beneath my feet. I stood barefoot on the cold linoleum. I walked over to the heavy wooden door and pressed my ear against the painted surface. The hallway was quiet. The night nurse had just finished his rounds and would not be back for another hour. At exactly midnight, a loud mechanical screech echoed through the walls of the building. It was followed by a deep rumbling vibration that I felt all the way down in the soles of my feet. I smiled in the dark room. Elias was right on time. 30 years ago, when we were building a high-rise on the south side, we had a major problem with the city water mains. I taught Elias a trick about industrial plumbing that you do not learn in any textbook. If you locate the primary pressure valve in a commercial boiler room and you manually reverse the backflow while simultaneously blocking the main drainage pipes, you create an enormous buildup of kinetic pressure. The water has nowhere to go but up. It fights the pipes until the metal groans, and when it finally breaches, it does not just leak. It explodes with the force of a small bomb. A few seconds later, the emergency alarms began to blare. The shrill, piercing sound of the sirens ripped through the quiet facility. Red emergency lights began flashing violently in the hallway outside my window. I heard the muffled shouts of the nursing staff as panic set in. "We have a massive flood in the laundry room," someone yelled down the corridor. "The pipes just burst. The water is rising fast and it is heading toward the electrical panels in the basement." I heard the heavy rubber clogs of the night nurse running past my door. Pinehaven was a severely underfunded facility holding onto a bare minimum skeleton crew. In a major facility crisis like a flooding basement threatening the main electrical grid, every single able-bodied staff member would be called down to help move expensive medical equipment and shut off the main water valves. The memory care ward was suddenly entirely abandoned. I stepped back from my door. During a severe structural emergency involving water and electricity, standard fire safety protocols dictate that all electronic magnetic locks automatically disengage. This is designed to prevent patients from being trapped in a fire or a blackout. I waited a few seconds, and then I heard the distinct, heavy click of the deadbolt sliding back inside the door frame. The red light on the keypad turned green. I pushed the heavy wooden door open. The hallway was bathed in the harsh, flashing red light of the emergency sirens. I stepped out into the corridor. I did not shuffle my feet. I did not hunch my shoulders. I walked with my back perfectly straight and my head held high. I ripped the plastic identification bracelet off my wrist and tossed it onto the dirty floor. I was no longer patient Julian Caldwell. I was the owner of an $8 million empire, and I was walking out of my cage. I moved quickly down the corridor, heading away from the main lobby and toward the rear of the building. I knew the layout of these cheap care centers perfectly. The service doors were always located near the kitchens and the loading docks to hide the garbage and the supply deliveries from the families. I pushed through a set of swinging double doors and entered the dark industrial kitchen. The smell of bleach and stale food was overwhelming, but I ignored it. I navigated through the maze of stainless steel prep tables and reached the heavy metal exit door at the very back. I pushed the metal crash bar. The door swung open and the freezing cold midnight air of Chicago hit my face. It felt like absolute freedom. It was the best thing I had breathed in days. I stepped out onto the concrete loading dock. The rain had stopped, but the ground was still wet and slick, reflecting the dim security lights. A beaten-up dark blue pickup truck was idling near the dumpsters. The headlights were off, but I could hear the low, familiar rumble of the engine. The passenger side door popped open from the inside. I walked down the concrete steps of the dock. I was halfway to the truck when a bright beam of light hit me directly in the face, blinding me instantly. "Hey, stop right there!" A loud, aggressive voice called out from the darkness. I stopped walking. I raised my hand to shield my eyes from the blinding glare of the heavy tactical flashlight. A security guard stepped out from the shadows near the edge of the building. He was a young man, probably in his late 20s, wearing a dark blue uniform. His right hand was resting firmly on the heavy black holster sitting on his hip. "Where do you think you are going, old man?" the guard demanded, stepping closer. He looked at my thin hospital gown and my bare feet. His voice was full of that arrogant, unearned authority that young men with badges often try to project when they think they have the upper hand. "You need to turn around and march your crazy ass right back inside before I put you on the ground." He thought he was dealing with a confused dementia patient who had wandered out during the alarm. He thought he could bully me into submission with a loud voice and a hand on a gun. He had no idea who he had just stopped. I lowered my hand. I did not look away from the blinding light. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. "Turn that light out of my face," I said. My voice was not a whisper. It was not the trembling, frail mumble I had been using for 4 days to trick my son. It was a deep, booming baritone. It was the exact voice I used when I stood on a steel beam 50 stories in the air and commanded a crew of 200 tough ironworkers. It was a voice that carried absolute, undeniable authority. It was a voice that expected instant obedience without question. The young guard hesitated. The sheer force and clarity of my tone caught him completely off guard. He lowered the flashlight just an inch, pointing it at my chest instead of my eyes, but his hand stayed firmly on his holster. I said, "Stop right there," the guard repeated, but the aggressive confidence was suddenly gone from his voice. It was replaced by a slight, noticeable tremor of uncertainty. "You are a patient here. You cannot leave the premises." I took another step closer, closing the distance between us until I was only a few feet away. I stood tall, towering over him in the dim light, despite my bare feet and my ridiculous patterned hospital gown. I locked my eyes onto his. "My name is Julian Caldwell," I stated, staring directly into his face with cold, absolute fury. "I am a commercial contractor and the primary owner of Caldwell Industrial Developments. You are currently standing on a property that is experiencing a catastrophic Class 3 plumbing failure that is violating 7 different municipal safety codes. I am leaving this unsafe premises right now, and you are not going to say a single word about it." The guard blinked, staring at me in total confusion. He had been trained to handle crying old men and lost grandmothers wandering the halls. He had absolutely no training on how to handle a millionaire contractor who spoke to him like he was an incompetent, lazy employee on a job site. "Sir, you are wearing a memory care patient gown," he stammered, taking a half step backward. "I have to call the head nurse and report this." "You call whoever you want, son," I snapped, cutting him off with a vicious, sharp slice of my hand. "But while you are dialing, you better ask them why they locked a man with a fully active corporate legal team inside a massive fire hazard. My lawyers are going to tear this facility apart, brick, by Monday morning. Now I'm going to ask you a very simple question. What is your badge number?" The guard froze completely. His hand slipped slowly away from his weapon. He looked down at his chest where his small silver name tag rested. He was realizing that he might be stepping into a situation that was way above his pay grade. "I do not have time for this," I barked, stepping right up into his personal space, forcing him to look up at me. "Give me your badge number right now." When the federal investigators arrive tomorrow to shut this place down, I want to make sure they know exactly which security guard tried to illegally detain me against my will during a structural emergency. Do you want to lose your job tonight, son? Do you want to be named personally in a multi-million-dollar federal lawsuit? No, sir. The guard mumbled, completely overwhelmed by the psychological assault. He took another large step backward, clearing the path to the idling truck. I am just doing my rounds. Then go do your rounds, I commanded, pointing a stiff, rigid finger toward the front of the building. Go help the nurses bail water out of the basement before the electrical grid catches fire and burns this place down. Get out of my sight right now. The young man did not say another word. He turned off his heavy flashlight, turned his back on me, and jogged away toward the front of the facility, eager to escape the confrontation. He had been completely dominated without a single physical blow being thrown. My mind was my weapon, and it was sharper than ever. I did not wait to watch him disappear into the dark. I walked over to the dark blue pickup truck and climbed into the passenger seat. I pulled the heavy metal door shut, locking it instantly. Elias was sitting behind the wheel. He was wearing his faded street clothes, having shed the Pine Haven janitor uniform. He put the truck into gear and pressed his foot hard on the gas. We rolled out of the dark parking lot, leaving the flashing red lights and the blaring sirens of the nursing home far behind us. I sat back against the worn fabric of the truck seat. The heater was blowing hot air onto my freezing legs. I reached up and adjusted the rearview mirror, turning it so I could see my own reflection in the dim green light of the dashboard. I looked terrible. My face was covered in a rough patch of gray stubble. My eyes were sunken from the terrible food and the lack of real sleep. I was wearing a cheap, humiliating piece of fabric that marked me as a helpless victim of society. I looked exactly like the man Kendrick wanted me to be. I looked like a man who had lost everything and was waiting to die, Julian Elias said, keeping his eyes carefully on the dark road ahead. We made it. Where to now? Do you want me to take you to a hotel so you can sleep before the meeting? I stared at my reflection in the mirror for a long time. Sleep was for men who had time to waste. I had a war to win in less than 9 hours. My son was going to wake up tomorrow morning thinking he was the king of the world. I reached up and wiped a smudge of dirt from my cheek. No, I said, my voice cold and sharp like a freshly honed blade. I have a boardroom meeting to attend tomorrow morning, and I refuse to execute my own son while wearing a hospital gown. I turned my head to look at Elias. Take me to my tailor. I told Elias to drive to the warehouse district. We were not going to the properties I owned, but to a small brick building tucked away in a narrow alley off the main grid. It was 2 a.m, but I knew the owner would be awake. The building belonged to Arthur. Arthur was a master tailor who had spent 40 years making bespoke suits for the mayors, the union bosses, and the heavy hitters of Chicago. Elias parked his beat-up truck near a rusted dumpster. I stepped out into the freezing night air. My bare feet stung against the wet asphalt, but I did not care. I walked up to the heavy metal door and knocked 3 times. A moment later, the door swung open. Arthur stood there holding a measuring tape. He took one look at my bare feet, my patchy gray beard, and the ridiculous patterned hospital gown. He did not ask a single question. He had known me for 30 years, and he knew my business was my own. He simply stepped aside and ushered me into the warm, brightly lit shop. I walked straight to the back bathroom. I turned the water on as hot as it would go. I stepped under the spray and stood there for a long time. I scrubbed my skin until it was red. I washed away the smell of the Pine Haven Memory Care Ward. I washed away the scent of industrial bleach, boiled vegetables, and sterile helplessness. I took a straight razor from the sink and carefully shaved the rough gray stubble off my face. I watched my jawline emerge sharp and strong in the foggy mirror. The frail, confused dementia patient was completely dead. I turned off the water and dried off. When I walked out of the bathroom, Arthur had a dark charcoal bespoke suit laid out on the massive wooden cutting table. It was tailored from heavy Italian wool. It was the exact shade of gray my wife Vivian always loved on me. I put on the crisp white dress shirt, the silk tie, and the heavy wool trousers. I slipped my feet into a pair of freshly polished black leather Oxfords. I turned and looked at my reflection in the tall, 3-way mirror. The transformation was absolute. The man looking back at me was a 75-year-old architect of destruction. I was no longer a victim waiting for a lethal injection. I was a king stepping back onto his battlefield. I buttoned the suit jacket, adjusted my cuffs, and thanked Arthur. I walked back out into the cold night and got back into the truck. Elias drove us toward the financial district. We pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner that sat under the shadow of the steel skyscrapers. The neon sign buzzed loudly through the heavy rain. I walked into the diner. The few truck drivers and night shift workers sitting at the counter took one look at my suit and immediately shifted out of my way. Power is not something you have to announce loudly. People can feel the weight of it on you. I walked to the back booth. Marcus was already there, sitting across from a younger man wearing a cheap gray raincoat. The young man was an agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation White-Collar Crime Division. I slid into the sticky vinyl booth next to Marcus. The federal agent stared at me. His eyes widened slightly in genuine surprise. He had clearly read the facility reports claiming I was a drooling invalid suffering from advanced neurological decay. I ordered a black coffee from the waitress and looked directly at the agent without blinking. Marcus slid a thick, heavy manila folder across the table. He explained that he had physically marched into the field office hours ago and slammed these documents onto the director's desk. The folder contained the original toxicology report from the underground lab, the video footage from my hidden living room cameras, and the sworn medical affidavits from the 3 specialists who had examined me earlier that week. The toxicology report was the undeniable hook. It proved definitively that Brooke, a senior pharmacist, was actively stealing heavy Schedule II narcotics from a major hospital to facilitate a massive financial crime. The federal government could ignore an old man complaining on a phone call, but they could not ignore a rogue pharmacist dealing fentanyl to secure an $8 million wire transfer. The feds were finally awake and they were very angry. The agent tapped his finger against his coffee mug. He leaned forward and lowered his voice. He told me they had a tactical strike team ready to mobilize at dawn. He said they were going to raid the law firm at exactly 9 o'clock the moment Kendrick and Brooke walked into the lobby. He wanted to arrest them before they even boarded the elevator to prevent any further escalation or risk. I leaned across the table, my face inches from his. I told him absolutely not. I explained the mechanics of the trap we had built. If the strike team arrested Kendrick in the lobby, he had not actually committed the ultimate crime yet. He would just be a man carrying a forged power of attorney document. His high-priced corporate defense lawyers would immediately argue that he was going to cancel the sale at the last minute. They would argue that he had a sudden change of heart. They would plead down the charges to attempted fraud or simple state-level forgery. Kendrick would serve a few months in a white-collar minimum security resort, and then he would walk right back out into the world. I told the agent I did not build this trap to wound the animal. I built it to break its neck. Kendrick needed to walk into that boardroom. He needed to sit down at that massive mahogany table. He needed to look the buyers in the eye and negotiate the final terms. He needed to take the gold pen in his hand and legally authorize the wire transfer of $8.5 million across state lines. He needed to complete the federal crime so completely that no lawyer in the world could save him. The agent shook his head, arguing that it was too risky. He said if the money actually transferred, it could instantly bounce through offshore shell accounts before the Bureau could freeze the transaction. He said the tech firm could lose millions. Marcus jumped in, backing me up with cold legal precision. He looked at the agent and laid out the reality of the irrevocable trust. Marcus explained that Kendrick was about to sell real estate assets that were firmly locked inside the Vivian Caldwell Trust. He had no legal authority to sell them. Furthermore, Marcus had already contacted the Federal Reserve and legally frozen the receiving accounts hours ago. The $8.5 million would never leave the escrow account. The money would hang in digital purgatory, giving the federal government all the absolute undeniable evidence they needed to secure a conviction with a mandatory minimum of 10 to 15 years. I told the agent to look at this like a construction project. You do not pour the concrete until the steel rebar is fully locked in place. If you pour it too early, the entire foundation will crack. Kendrick signing that paper was the final piece of steel. The agent looked at my cold expression. He looked at the tailored suit and the absolute lack of hesitation in my voice. He realized he was not dealing with an elderly victim who needed protection. He was dealing with a man who had engineered a flawless execution. The agent finally nodded his head in agreement. He agreed to hold the tactical strike team in the emergency stairwell outside the 50th floor boardroom until I gave the absolute signal. We spent the next 3 hours sitting in that diner drinking bitter black coffee and reviewing every single variable. We synchronized our watches down to the exact second. We mapped out the exits of the high-rise building. We discussed the layout of the boardroom. We left absolutely nothing to chance. I was going to control the room, and the federal agents were going to be my hammer. The sun finally began to rise over Lake Michigan, painting the gray rain clouds with streaks of cold, pale morning light. It was Friday morning. The day of the harvest had finally arrived. Elias drove me downtown and dropped me off 3 blocks away from the massive glass tower where the closing meeting was taking place. I told Elias to wait in the truck. I walked the rest of the way, blending in perfectly with the crowds of early morning executives and wealthy bankers. I walked through the sliding glass doors into the soaring marble lobby of the law firm building. I took a seat on a dark leather bench partially hidden behind a massive indoor tropical planter. I picked up a copy of a financial newspaper and held it up, masking my face. I waited. At exactly 8:55, the heavy revolving glass doors at the front of the lobby spun. Kendrick walked into the building. He was wearing a dark navy suit that screamed new money. His hair was perfectly styled. Brooke was walking right beside him, wearing a tailored white dress and holding a sleek designer leather briefcase. They looked like the perfect successful corporate couple. They were smiling brightly. Kendrick was laughing at something she said, adjusting his expensive silk tie. They looked incredibly relaxed and victorious. They walked right past the planter where I was sitting. They were less than 10 feet away from me, completely oblivious to my presence. They stepped into the polished silver elevator bank and pressed the button for the 50th floor. The doors slid shut, hiding their smiling faces. They were walking straight up into the glass-walled boardroom of a massive downtown law firm. They thought they were walking into a kingdom of permanent wealth. They thought I was currently lying in a urine-soaked bed in a locked facility waiting for Brooke to come and stop my heart. They did not know the floor of that boardroom was made of pure dynamite. They did not know that the old mechanic was already inside the building and I was holding the match. I stood in the narrow concrete emergency stairwell on the 50th floor of the corporate high-rise. The air was cold and smelled of dust and floor wax. Next to me stood 3 federal agents wearing heavy tactical vests over their dress shirts. The lead agent, the young man from the diner, held a small black radio receiver in his hand. He had slipped a tiny audio bug into the boardroom earlier that morning, disguised as a digital conference microphone. We were listening to every single word happening on the other side of the heavy mahogany doors. I looked down at my bespoke charcoal suit. It fit me perfectly, like a heavy suit of armor. Just 12 hours ago, I was wearing a thin, scratchy hospital gown, sitting barefoot on a cold linoleum floor, waiting for a lethal injection. Kendrick and Brooke thought I was still rotting in that locked memory care ward. They had absolutely no idea the ghost they created was currently standing 50 feet away from them, surrounded by federal law enforcement. The audio feed from the boardroom was crystal clear. I could hear the soft clinking of expensive coffee cups hitting glass saucers. I heard the deep, confident voice of the lead executive from the Silicon Valley Data Center Corporation. He was welcoming Kendrick and Brooke to the closing meeting. He thanked them for traveling downtown so early in the morning. Then I heard my son's voice. Kendrick sounded incredibly smooth and polished. He thanked the executives for their time and their patience. He told them how difficult the last few weeks had been for his family. He lied with the practiced ease of a career criminal, completely comfortable in his deception. "It breaks my heart to sell these properties," Kendrick said, his voice dropping into a register of perfectly manufactured grief. "My father built those warehouses from the ground up. He spent his entire life working on those properties. But his mind is completely gone now. The dementia came on so fast and so aggressively that the doctors say he needs around-the-clock specialized care. We had to move him into a secure memory facility just for his own physical safety. Selling this portfolio is the only way to ensure he gets the medical attention he desperately needs for the rest of his life." I felt a muscle jump in my jaw, my hands curled into tight fists at my sides. He was selling 30 years of my sweat and blood to pay for a prison he had personally locked me inside. He was using my legacy to fund his own greed while pretending to be a noble, grieving son. Then Brooke spoke up over the audio feed. Her voice was soft and full of clinical sympathy. As a senior pharmacist, she said, "I see rapid cognitive decline every single day. But watching it happen to a man as strong and independent as Julian has been absolutely devastating for our family. It is a terrible disease. We just want him to be at peace and to suffer as little as possible." The executives in this boardroom murmured their condolences. They told Kendrick he was doing the right thing. They told him how noble it was to step up and take on the heavy burden of the general power of attorney to protect his incapacitated father. They had absolutely no idea they were sitting across the table from 2 people who had forged that document and planned to administer a lethal dose of fentanyl later that very same afternoon. The boardroom fell completely silent for a moment as the corporate lawyers began shuffling heavy stacks of thick paper. The lead real estate attorney cleared his throat. He explained the final terms of the massive corporate acquisition. He stated that the tech firm would be taking immediate permanent possession of the entire West Loop block of warehouses. He confirmed the final purchase price of $8.5 million. He explained that the funds were currently sitting in an escrow account managed by the Federal Reserve and were ready for immediate digital transfer upon the final signature of the authorized representative. My heart pounded a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. The moment of absolute truth was arriving. I looked at the lead federal agent standing next to me in the stairwell. His face was tense and focused. He kept his finger hovering over the transmit button on his shoulder radio, ready to signal the strike team. If we walked into that boardroom right now, Kendrick could simply drop the pen. He could claim he was just reviewing the documents and had not decided whether to sell yet. He could claim it was a misunderstanding. We had to wait for the ink to touch the page. We had to let him cross the absolute point of no return so the federal crime would be locked in stone. "Mr. Caldwell," the corporate attorney said, his voice echoing clearly over the small black receiver, "we have thoroughly reviewed the general power of attorney document you provided to us earlier this week. It appears to be in perfect legal order, giving you full authorization to sell your father's personal and commercial assets. I have placed the final transfer authorization form directly in front of you. Once you sign your name on the bottom line, the $8.5 million will be wired instantly into your designated corporate business account, and the real estate properties will officially belong to our firm." There was a long, agonizing pause over the radio feed. I pictured the massive boardroom in my mind. I pictured Kendrick sitting in a high-backed leather executive chair staring down at the thick white paper. I pictured the heavy gold pen resting on the polished mahogany table right next to the document. This was the moment where a normal man might feel a sharp twinge of guilt. This was the moment where a son might remember the father who carried him on his shoulders, taught him how to ride a bicycle, and worked 16-hour shifts pouring concrete to pay for his college tuition. I waited in the cold stairwell, listening intently to the dead air on the radio. I waited to hear if Kendrick had even a tiny fraction of a soul left inside his expensive tailored suit. I waited to see if he would hesitate. Kendrick finally broke the silence. "Do I need to initial the side margins on page 4? He asked. His voice was completely steady. There was absolutely no tremor of remorse. There was no hesitation. He was only concerned about getting the paperwork exactly right so the massive wire transfer would not be delayed. "Just the bottom line on the final page, sir," the attorney replied smoothly. A second later, I heard it. The tiny audio bug picked up the distinct, sharp sound of a heavy metal pen scratching quickly across thick, high-quality paper. It was a fast, aggressive sound. Kendrick was signing away my entire empire without a second thought. He was permanently cementing his own destruction for a pile of digital money. "Excellent," the attorney said. "The signature is confirmed and witnessed. I am entering the authorization code into the banking portal right now." I heard the rapid clicking of a computer keyboard over the audio feed. Every single keystroke was another nail in my son's coffin. The tension in the stairwell was so thick it felt like I was breathing underwater. The federal agent looked at me, waiting for the signal. I held my hand up, telling him to wait just a few more seconds. I needed the digital money to move. I needed the wire fraud to be absolutely entirely complete. "The transaction is officially complete," the attorney announced, his voice full of professional satisfaction. "The $8.5 million has been wired to your account, Mr. Caldwell. Congratulations to you and your wife. The West Loop properties are officially ours." I heard Brooke let out a soft, breathy sigh of relief. I could picture her turning her head and smiling at my son. They thought they were rich. They thought they were completely invincible. They thought they were finally free of the heavy, useless burden of my existence. They thought they had successfully navigated a multi-million-dollar corporate heist without leaving a single trace of evidence behind. The federal crime of massive wire fraud was now officially locked in the permanent digital records of the United States banking system. The crime could never be undone. It was time to bring the building down. I looked at the lead federal agent and gave him a single sharp nod. The agent immediately pushed the heavy concrete door of the stairwell open. The 3 tactical officers moved rapidly out into the plush, carpeted hallway of the 50th floor. I walked right behind them, matching their urgent, aggressive pace. My bespoke charcoal suit moved perfectly with my stride. The anger inside me was completely gone, replaced by an icy, flawless focus. We reached the massive double mahogany doors of the corporate boardroom. The federal agents did not bother to knock. They did not announce their presence. The lead agent raised his heavy black combat boot and kicked the exact center of the wooden doors with explosive, devastating force. The heavy mahogany doors blew inward violently, crashing against the interior walls of the boardroom like a massive clap of thunder. The sound was absolutely deafening inside the glass-walled room. The lead executive from the Silicon Valley tech firm jumped so hard he spilled his hot coffee all over his expensive silk tie. The corporate real estate attorney froze completely, his fingers hovering stiffly over his laptop keyboard. The entire room snapped their heads toward the entryway in absolute shock. I did not wait for the dust to settle. I stepped through the threshold and walked directly into the center of the massive room. I did not shuffle. I did not hunch my shoulders or drag my feet. I walked with the heavy, measured stride of a man who owned the ground he was stepping on. My back was perfectly straight. My head was held high. The bespoke charcoal Italian wool suit draped over my shoulders like a suit of armor. My white dress shirt was crisp, and my black leather Oxford shoes shined under the bright recessed lighting of the boardroom. I looked exactly like the man I truly was. I was Julian Caldwell. I was the architect of an $8 million empire, and I had come to collect my debts. The boardroom completely froze. For 5 agonizing seconds, nobody took a breath. The only sound in the enormous room was the soft hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. I locked my eyes entirely on the head of the massive wooden table. Kendrick was sitting in the high-backed leather executive chair. Just seconds ago, he had been the king of the world, smiling and laughing as he stole my life. Now he looked like a man who had just seen a ghost walk out of a grave. All the blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of dirty ash. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. His hand, which was still resting on the final page of the transfer authorization form, began to tremble violently. The heavy gold pen slipped right out of his fingers. It hit the polished mahogany table with a sharp clatter and rolled slowly across the smooth wood. It fell off the edge of the table and hit the thick carpet. It was a tiny sound, but in that frozen room it echoed like a gunshot. Brooke was sitting right next to him. She did not look like a confident senior pharmacist anymore. She looked absolutely terrified. She dropped her sleek designer briefcase onto the floor. She gasped loudly, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. Her pale blue eyes were wide with pure panic. She stared at my clean-shaven face. She stared at my sharp-tailored suit. Her medical training was calculating the impossibility of the situation. She knew the heavy chemical cocktail she had prescribed. She knew I should be lying in a urine-soaked bed, unable to speak or move. She realized in that exact fraction of a second that her poison had never worked. She realized I knew everything. The silence was heavy and suffocating. The executives from the data center corporation looked back and forth between me and Kendrick. They were highly intelligent men, and they could read the sudden terrifying shift in the atmosphere. They could see the absolute guilt radiating from my son. Kendrick possessed a vicious survival instinct. He realized his entire future was collapsing right in front of his eyes. He tried to desperately pivot. He tried to play his final card. He scrambled to his feet, pushing his heavy leather chair back so hard it crashed into the glass window behind him. He threw his hands up in the air, putting on a mask of frantic, exaggerated concern. "Oh my God, Dad," he shouted, his voice cracking with artificial panic. "How did you get out?" He did not wait for me to answer. He turned frantically toward the tech executives and the corporate attorney, spreading his arms wide in an apologetic gesture. "Gentlemen, I am so incredibly sorry for this interruption," Kendrick stammered, speaking fast and breathing heavily. "Please excuse this. My father is severely demented. He is very sick. He must have wandered off from his secure memory care facility this morning. He does not know where he is or what he is doing. He is completely confused." He was incredibly pathetic. He was standing in a room full of highly educated professionals trying to convince them that the impeccably dressed man staring him down with cold, focused fury was a confused invalid. He stepped away from the table and walked toward me. He reached out his hands, wanting to grab my shoulders. He wanted to physically spin me around and push me back out into the hallway before I could ruin his multi-million-dollar theft. "Come on, Dad," Kendrick said, using that sickening, sweet, condescending tone he had used in my living room. "Let us get you back to the hospital. You need to rest. You are going to hurt yourself." He took one more step toward me, his hands reaching out to grab the fabric of my suit. I did not step back. I drew a deep breath of the cool, conditioned air into my lungs. "Sit down, Kendrick." I did not yell. I did not have to. My voice boomed through that glass boardroom like rolling thunder. It carried the weight of 30 years of commanding construction sites. It carried the absolute authority of a father who was entirely done with his disobedient child. The sheer force and volume of the command hit Kendrick like a physical blow to the chest. He stopped dead in his tracks. His hands dropped slowly to his sides. He looked at my eyes and he saw absolutely no confusion. He saw no dementia. He saw no weakness. He saw a man who had engineered his total destruction. I said, "Sit down." I repeated, my voice dropping into a low, dangerous growl. You do not speak to me. You do not touch me. You do not take another step. You just sold a block of commercial real estate that you do not own, and you are going to sit in that chair and face the consequences of your actions. Kendrick swallowed hard. His knees buckled slightly. He backed away from me, retreating slowly until the back of his legs hit his heavy leather chair. He collapsed into the seat, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. The corporate real estate attorney stood up from his laptop. "Excuse me, sir," the attorney said, looking at me with severe confusion. "I do not understand what is happening here. Who are you and what do you mean he does not own the properties? We just finalized the wire transfer based on a legally binding general power of attorney." "You finalized a fraudulent transfer based on a forged document," I said, keeping my eyes locked on Kendrick. Before the attorney could ask another question, the heavy mahogany doors opened wider. Marcus Vance stepped into the boardroom. He looked like a shark smelling blood in the water. He was wearing a sharp navy blue suit and carrying a thick black leather briefcase. He walked with total confidence, moving past me and stepping directly up to the massive wooden conference table. "My name is Marcus Vance," he announced, his voice crisp and professional. "I am the senior corporate legal counsel representing Mr. Julian Caldwell. My client is the sole legal beneficiary of the Vivian Caldwell Irrevocable Trust. The commercial properties you just attempted to purchase were legally transferred into that trust 4 days ago. The man sitting at the head of your table, Mr. Kendrick Caldwell, has absolutely no legal authority over that trust. Furthermore, the power of attorney document he presented to your firm contains a completely fraudulent signature." The corporate attorney turned pale. He looked down at his laptop screen and then looked at Kendrick. "You committed wire fraud," the attorney whispered in horror. "You used our firm to facilitate a federal crime." Kendrick tried to speak. He opened his mouth, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He looked at Brooke, but she was staring at the doorway, frozen in absolute terror, because right behind Marcus, the cavalry finally arrived. 5 men walked into the boardroom, filling the space with the heavy, intimidating weight of federal law enforcement. The first 3 men were wearing dark navy windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI printed boldly across their chests. They were agents from the white-collar crime division. The 2 men walking right behind them were wearing tactical vests with the letters DEA printed on the back. They were agents from the Drug Enforcement Administration. They fanned out instantly. 2 agents moved to block the main exit. 1 agent moved to secure the large glass windows. The lead agent from the diner, the young man in the cheap gray raincoat, walked directly up to the table. He pulled a silver badge from his pocket and held it up for the room to see. "Nobody move." The lead federal agent commanded, his voice cutting through the panic in the room. The tech executives immediately threw their hands up and backed away from the table, wanting absolutely nothing to do with the federal raid. The corporate lawyers froze in place. "Kendrick Caldwell," the federal agent said, looking down at my son. "We have been monitoring the digital escrow accounts at the Federal Reserve. We just recorded your authorization of an $8.5 million wire transfer using fraudulent documents. You are currently under investigation for conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and identity theft." Kendrick began to hyperventilate. He grabbed the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning completely white. No, you do not understand," he gasped, looking back and forth between the agents and me. "He is my father. We had an agreement. He told me to sell the buildings. He is just confused. He is sick." The lead agent did not even blink. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thick folded stack of papers. "We have 3 sworn medical affidavits from leading specialists confirming your father is in perfect mental health," he stated coldly. "We also have high-definition video footage of you forging his signature on that power of attorney document in his living room. Your lies are over, Mr. Caldwell." Brooke suddenly stood up. Her chair scraped loudly against the carpet. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger at Kendrick. It was his idea, she screamed, her voice shrill and desperate. She was throwing her husband completely under the bus to save her own skin. "I did not want to do it. Kendrick forced me. He said we needed the money. I am just a pharmacist. I had nothing to do with the real estate." One of the drug enforcement agents stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. "Brooke Caldwell," the agent said, his voice completely devoid of any sympathy. "We have the toxicology reports from the underground laboratory. We have the stolen inventory logs from your hospital pharmacy. And we have the medical directives you signed yesterday authorizing a lethal dose of fentanyl for a patient who does not have dementia. You are not being investigated for real estate fraud, ma'am. You are being investigated for the theft of Schedule II narcotics and conspiracy to commit premeditated murder." Brooke let out a horrifying, piercing scream. Her legs completely gave out beneath her. She collapsed onto the thick carpet, sobbing hysterically and covering her face with her hands. Kendrick looked at his crying wife on the floor. He looked at the federal agents surrounding him with handcuffs ready. He looked at the tech executives who were staring at him with absolute disgust. His entire perfect, wealthy, arrogant world had just evaporated into thin air in less than 2 minutes. Finally, he looked up at me. His eyes were completely red. Tears were streaming down his face, ruining his perfect appearance. He looked like a frightened, pathetic little boy who had just been caught stealing. Dad, Kendrick whispered, his voice breaking into a miserable sob. Dad, please. I am your son. You cannot let them do this to me. We are family. You have to tell them to stop, please, Dad. I looked down at the boy I had raised. I looked at the man who had ordered the nurses at Pine Haven to watch me die so he could buy a bigger house. I felt absolutely nothing. The trap was sprung. The concrete was poured. It was time to replace the rusted hinge. The heavy mahogany doors were still vibrating on their hinges as the reality of the situation settled over the boardroom. The lead tech executive from Silicon Valley stood up and backed away from the table as if it were on fire. He looked at the federal agents, and then he looked at Kendrick. The corporate real estate attorney was frantically typing on his laptop, trying to reverse the digital wire transfer, but his screen was already locked. I walked slowly and deliberately to the end of the long table. The room parted for me like water. Marcus Vance stood right beside me, opening his thick black leather briefcase. He pulled out a stack of legally sealed documents and dropped them right on top of the fraudulent power of attorney Kendrick had just signed. Let us be absolutely clear about what just happened in this room, Marcus said, his voice echoing sharply off the glass walls. Mr. Kendrick Caldwell presented a general power of attorney document to facilitate the sale of commercial real estate. That document is entirely fraudulent. The signature at the bottom does not belong to my client Julian Caldwell. It is a crude forgery. The corporate attorney looked up, his face pale and sweating. He pointed a shaking finger at Kendrick. You told us he signed it in front of you? The attorney stammered. You swore under penalty of perjury that you were the legal guardian of his estate. Kendrick was paralyzed. He was trapped in the leather executive chair, unable to breathe. He looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, hoping I would somehow stop this nightmare. But I just stood there in my charcoal suit watching him drown. The forgery is only the beginning. Marcus continued, pulling a second set of documents from his briefcase. 4 days ago, my client established the Vivian Caldwell Irrevocable Trust. He transferred every single commercial warehouse, every empty lot, and every business account he owned directly into that trust. The properties you just attempted to purchase do not belong to Julian Caldwell, and they certainly do not belong to his son. They belong to a corporate entity that Kendrick has absolutely no legal authority over. The lead tech executive gasped. He looked at his own legal team in sheer panic. We just wired $8.5 million, the executive yelled. We authorized a federal wire transfer across state lines for a property this man does not even own. Marcus offered a cold, thin smile. Exactly, Marcus said. You authorized the transfer, and the moment the digital funds crossed the state line, the crime of federal wire fraud was officially completed. But you do not need to worry about your money, gentlemen. I contacted the Federal Reserve hours ago and flagged the receiving accounts. Your $8.5 million is currently frozen in digital escrow. You will get every single penny back. The only person losing anything today is the man sitting at the head of the table. The lead federal agent from the white-collar crime division stepped forward. He pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. The metallic clink of the steel echoed loudly in the silent room. Kendrick Caldwell, the agent said, his voice devoid of any emotion. Stand up and place your hands behind your back. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and identity theft. You are looking at a mandatory minimum sentence of 15 years in a federal penitentiary. Kendrick could not stand up. His legs refused to work. He slumped in the chair, shaking his head back and forth as if trying to wake up from a terrible dream. While Kendrick was mentally collapsing, the two agents from the Drug Enforcement Administration moved around the large mahogany table. They walked directly toward Brooke. Brooke was still on the floor, her designer dress bunched up around her knees, her face completely pale. She tried to scramble backward away from the agents, but her back hit the thick glass window. Brooke Caldwell, the senior drug enforcement agent, said, looking down at her with absolute disgust. Stand up. Brooke shook her head, tears streaming down her carefully makeup-covered face. I did not do anything, she sobbed. I am just his wife. I did not sign any of those real estate papers. You cannot arrest me for his financial crimes. We are not arresting you for financial crimes, ma'am, the agent replied smoothly. He reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He held it up so she could see the printed chemical graphs. "This is a certified toxicology report from an independent laboratory," the agent explained loudly, so everyone in the room could hear. "It details a lethal chemical cocktail of heavy antipsychotics and sustained-release sedatives. We also pulled the digital inventory logs from your hospital pharmacy this morning. You personally signed out massive quantities of those exact same Schedule II narcotics over the last 14 days. And yesterday you filed a medical directive at the Pine Haven Care Facility authorizing a lethal dose of fentanyl for a patient who does not even have dementia." Brooke let out a horrifying high-pitched whine. She looked like a trapped animal. "You are under arrest for the theft of Schedule II narcotics," the agent continued, pulling out his own set of handcuffs. "You are also under arrest for conspiracy to commit premeditated murder. Stand up and put your hands behind your back." The words premeditated murder hung in the air like a heavy cloud of toxic smoke. The corporate executives backed even further away from the table, horrified that they had been doing business with an attempted murderer. Brooke realized there was absolutely no escape. The evidence was overwhelming, and her medical career, her freedom, and her luxurious lifestyle were completely over. In that moment of absolute desperation, the true nature of her character revealed itself completely. She did not look at her husband with love or solidarity. She looked at him with pure, vicious hatred. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the federal agent standing right in front of her. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at Kendrick. "It was his idea!" She screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with hysteria. "It was all his idea. I did not want to do it. Kendrick forced me. He told me his company was going bankrupt. He told me we were going to lose the house and the cars. He said his father was just a useless old man hoarding millions of dollars. He told me to steal the drugs. He told me to make the poison." Kendrick snapped his head toward his wife. His eyes widened in absolute shock. "Brooke, what are you doing?" he gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "I am telling the truth," she yelled back at him, tears ruining her mascara. "I am not going to federal prison for the rest of my life because of you. You forged the signature. You signed the do not resuscitate order. You wanted him dead, Kendrick. You planned the whole thing. Tell them it was your idea." The loyalty between thieves is a very fragile thing. As soon as the trap snaps shut, they will tear each other apart just to survive an extra 5 minutes. I watched my daughter-in-law completely betray my son in front of a room full of federal agents. It was a pathetic, ugly display, but it was exactly what they both deserved. The drug enforcement agent grabbed Brooke by the arm and spun her around. He snapped the heavy steel handcuffs around her wrists, locking them tight. She continued to scream and cry, kicking her expensive leather boots against the carpet as they dragged her away from the table and out into the hallway. Her screams faded as the elevator doors closed behind her. The room was quiet again, except for the heavy, ragged breathing of my son. Kendrick looked at the empty space where his wife had just been standing. He looked at the corporate attorneys who were packing up their laptops as fast as they could to escape the crime scene. He looked at the federal agents standing over him, waiting for him to stand up. His entire perfect, wealthy, arrogant world had just evaporated into thin air in less than 5 minutes. He had no wife. He had no money. He had no company. He had absolutely nothing left. Finally, he looked up at me. I was standing tall at the end of the table. My face was completely devoid of emotion. I was an old mechanic looking at a rusted, broken machine that was about to be thrown into the scrapyard. Kendrick slowly slid out of the heavy leather chair. His legs could not support his weight. He dropped to the thick carpet, landing heavily on his knees. He did not care about the tech executives watching him. He did not care about his pride. He crawled forward on his knees, inching his way toward me across the expensive floor. "Dad," he whispered, his voice breaking into a miserable, pathetic sob. He looked up at me, his face completely red and covered in tears. The arrogant smirk was entirely gone. The condescending tone he had used when he dropped me off at the nursing home was completely erased. He looked exactly like a frightened little boy who had just been caught stealing and was terrified of the punishment. "Dad, please," he begged, reaching out with his shaking hands toward my polished leather shoes. "I am so sorry. I made a mistake. I was stressed about the company and Brooke put the ideas in my head. You know I would never really hurt you. You know I love you." I looked down at him. I did not move my feet. I did not reach out to comfort him. "Please, Dad," Kendrick cried loudly, the tears streaming down his face and dripping onto his expensive silk tie. "You have to tell them to stop. You have to tell the agents it was just a misunderstanding. I am your son. You cannot let them take me to prison. We are blood, Dad. We are family. You cannot do this to me. We are blood." I looked down at the man kneeling on the thick carpet at my feet. Kendrick was sobbing so hard his shoulders were shaking violently. He reached out with his perfectly manicured hands, trying to grasp the fabric of my suit trousers. He was begging me to save him from the federal agents standing right behind him. He kept repeating the word family over and over again as if it were a magical spell that could erase the fact that he had just tried to steal my life and murder me in a nursing home bed. The federal agents did not move. They were waiting for my reaction. They had seen families fall apart before. They knew that sometimes the victims crack under the emotional weight of seeing their own children in handcuffs. They were giving me a moment to say goodbye. But I had already said goodbye to my son. I said goodbye to him the moment I stood in his hallway and listened to him agree to poison my food. I said goodbye to him when he handed me a forged document and called me a useless burden. The man crying on the floor in front of me was not the little boy I taught to ride a bicycle. He was just a thief who had gotten caught in a trap he helped build. I did not feel any tears forming in my eyes. My chest was not tight with grief. My heart beat with a slow, steady rhythm. I looked down at him with the cold, detached observation of a mechanic inspecting a broken piece of machinery. I took a slow step back, pulling my shoes out of his reach. "Blood just means we share genetics, Kendrick," I said. My voice was perfectly flat and devoid of any warmth. "It does not mean I have to let a parasite bleed me dry." Kendrick looked up at me. His face was a mess of tears and panic. He opened his mouth to argue, but I did not let him speak. I spent my entire life building structures that are designed to last. I continued, my voice echoing off the glass walls of the massive boardroom. I poured concrete foundations that can withstand earthquakes. I welded steel beams that can hold up skyscrapers. I know exactly what it takes to keep a structure standing strong against the elements. But every now and then, a piece of hardware goes bad. You find a hinge that is rusted all the way through. It groans and it complains, and it threatens to bring the entire heavy door crashing down on top of you. Kendrick stared at me, his breathing coming in short, ragged gasps. "When a hinge rusts completely through, you do not sit on the floor and cry over it," I told him, looking directly into his terrified eyes. "You do not try to paint over the rust and pretend it is still strong. You take a screwdriver and you unscrew it. You pull it out of the wood, you throw it in the trash, and you replace it." The words hit him harder than any physical blow. The absolute finality in my voice destroyed the last tiny shred of hope he was clinging to. He realized I was not going to protect him. He realized the father he thought was weak and naive was actually made of solid iron. He let out a long, miserable wail and dropped his head into his hands. I looked at the lead federal agent and gave him a single nod. The agent stepped forward immediately. He grabbed Kendrick by the back of his expensive suit jacket and hauled him roughly to his feet. Kendrick offered no physical resistance. His legs were completely useless. The agent spun him around and snapped the heavy steel handcuffs over his wrists. The loud click of the metal locking mechanism finalized the severing of our relationship. "Let us go, Mr. Caldwell," the agent said, pushing Kendrick toward the shattered mahogany doors. "You have a very long day ahead of you." The agents marched him out of the boardroom. Kendrick did not look back at me. He kept his head down, staring at the floor as they dragged him down the carpeted hallway. A few seconds later, the heavy silver doors of the elevator slid shut, and my son was entirely gone from my life. The room was completely silent again. The remaining federal agents were quietly packing up the fraudulent documents into clear plastic evidence bags. Marcus Vance stood near the window, looking out over the city with a deeply satisfied expression on his face. I turned my attention to the other side of the massive wooden table. The lead executive from the Silicon Valley Data Center Corporation was standing near the wall with his legal team. They all looked incredibly pale and extremely uncomfortable. They had just witnessed a brutal family destruction and a massive federal raid before they had even finished their morning coffee. The lead executive was holding his leather briefcase tight against his chest like a shield. He was clearing his throat, preparing to make a very fast exit. "Mr. Caldwell," the executive said, his voice trembling slightly, "I cannot even begin to express how sorry we are for this entire situation. We had absolutely no idea that your son was operating outside of his legal authority. We pride ourselves on ethical business practices." His corporate attorney nodded vigorously, standing right beside him. "We will cooperate fully with the federal authorities," the attorney added quickly. "We will provide all the emails and the preliminary contracts to prove we were acting in good faith. We just want to wipe our hands clean of this entire terrible mess. I understand completely, I said, keeping my posture relaxed but completely dominant. You were victims of a highly sophisticated fraud scheme just like I was. My legal team will ensure your firm is completely shielded from any criminal liability. You have my word on that. The executive let out a massive sigh of relief. Thank you, sir, he said, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. We will have our banking representatives cancel the digital escrow hold immediately. We will back out of the real estate sector in Chicago entirely. We do not want to cause you any more distress. Have a good day, Mr. Caldwell. The executives turned around and started walking toward the broken mahogany doors. They wanted to run out of that high-rise tower and get on the first private jet back to California. I watched them take 3 hurried steps. Hold on a minute, gentlemen, I called out. The group of executives froze in their tracks. They turned around slowly, looking at me with nervous expressions. The lead executive gripped his briefcase even tighter. Yes, sir? The executive asked, his voice tight with anxiety. Is there a problem? I walked slowly around the edge of the massive wooden conference table. I ran my hand along the polished mahogany surface, feeling the solid weight of the wood. I walked all the way to the head of the table. I looked at the heavy leather executive chair where Kendrick had been sitting just 10 minutes ago. I pulled the chair out and I sat down. The leather was cool and comfortable. I adjusted the lapels of my charcoal bespoke suit. I rested my forearms on the table and folded my hands together. I looked at the terrified tech executive standing near the door. My son is a criminal and a fool, I said, my voice projecting clearly across the large room. He tried to sell you an $8 million commercial real estate portfolio for $8.5 million. That was his first massive mistake. Those warehouses sit directly on the expanding edge of the Fulton Market District. The city is planning to run a new fiber optic grid right under that exact street next year. That land is not worth $8.5 million. It is worth at least $12 million. The executive stared at me. The lead executive slowly lowered his briefcase. The panic in his eyes began to fade, replaced by the sharp, calculating look of a seasoned corporate buyer. He realized he was no longer dealing with a frantic crime scene. He was dealing with a businessman who knew exactly what he was holding. I leaned forward slightly, resting my chin on my hands. I looked directly into the eyes of the lead executive. You flew all the way from Silicon Valley to Chicago because you desperately need that land for your new data center, I told him. You need the solid concrete foundations my warehouses provide. You need the industrial power grid that is already wired into those specific city blocks. You want the properties. And despite the unpleasantness of this morning, I am still a man who is perfectly willing to do business. The room was completely quiet. Marcus Vance walked over and took a seat right next to me, pulling a fresh legal pad from his briefcase. He clicked his gold fountain pen, completely ready to begin drawing up legitimate contracts. The lead executive looked at his corporate attorney. The attorney gave him a very slow, confirming nod. The fear was entirely gone from the room now. The chaos of the federal raid was replaced by the cold, clean logic of corporate commerce. The executive walked slowly back toward the massive wooden table. He pulled out a leather chair directly opposite me and sat down. He placed his briefcase on the table and popped the golden latches open. I smiled. It was the first genuine smile I had allowed myself to feel in weeks. It was not a smile of joy or happiness. It was the sharp, satisfying smile of a man who had successfully dismantled a rusted, broken machine and built a brand new empire directly on top of its ashes. Let us talk numbers, I said. 3 months later, I sat in the hard wooden pews of the federal courthouse in downtown Chicago. The room smelled of polished oak and old paper. The high ceilings echoed with the heavy footsteps of the armed bailiffs. I wore my charcoal bespoke suit. I sat perfectly still with my hands resting on my knees. I was not there to offer support. I was there to witness the final adjustment of a broken machine. Kendrick was brought into the courtroom through a side door. He was wearing a baggy orange jumpsuit. The expensive tailored suits, the silk ties, and the arrogant smirk were completely gone. His hair was unkempt and his face was hollow. He looked like a man who had not slept a single night since the heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom crashed open. He did not look around the room. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor as he shuffled toward the defense table. His wrists and ankles were chained. The sound of the chains dragging across the carpet was the only sound in the silent courtroom. The federal judge was a stern woman who did not tolerate excuses. She read the charges out loud. Conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and identity theft. Kendrick had pleaded guilty to avoid a drawn-out trial, but the federal guidelines were absolutely ruthless. The The judge looked down at him and delivered the sentence: 12 years in a federal penitentiary. In the federal system, there is no early parole for good behavior. You serve the exact time you are given. Kendrick finally turned his head and looked back at the gallery. He looked right at me. His eyes were begging for a final ounce of pity. I looked back at him and I gave him absolutely nothing. I did not blink. I did not nod. I simply watched the bailiffs grab his arms and lead him out of the room. Brooke was sentenced later that same afternoon in a different courtroom. She had tried everything to save herself. She had offered to testify against Kendrick. She had blamed the stress of her job. She had even tried to claim she was suffering from a mental breakdown. But the federal prosecutors had the certified toxicology reports and the stolen hospital inventory logs. They had the do not resuscitate order and the lethal medical directives. The judge looked at her with pure disgust. A senior pharmacist using her medical access to execute an elderly man for real estate money was a crime that demanded a heavy example. She received 15 years for the theft of Schedule II narcotics and conspiracy to commit premeditated murder. When she heard the number, she collapsed against the defense table, sobbing uncontrollably. Nobody rushed to comfort her. Her wealthy friends had abandoned her. Her hospital had publicly terminated her. She was entirely alone. When the court proceedings were over, I walked out of the heavy federal building and into the crisp afternoon air. The sky over Chicago was a bright, piercing blue. I got into my truck and drove away from the city center. I did not go back to my empty house. I drove out to the quiet green hills of the cemetery on the south side. I parked the truck and walked down the paved path until I reached a familiar spot under a large oak tree. I stood in front of the polished black marble headstone. The name Vivian Caldwell was engraved in sharp, elegant letters. I stood there for a long time, listening to the wind rustle the dry autumn leaves. "I did it, Vivian," I said, my voice low and steady in the quiet graveyard. I told her everything that had happened over the last 3 months. I told her about the poison, the nursing home, and the federal raid. I told her about the boy we had raised together. I remembered the days when we had nothing but a small kitchen table and a stack of blueprints. I remembered how hard we worked to build a legacy that would protect our family. We thought our wealth would be a shield for our son. We never realized that we were actually building a weapon that he would eventually turn against us. I looked down at the green grass covering her resting place. The cancer of greed infected our family, Vivian, I told her. It took root in our son and it poisoned his heart completely. He forgot the value of hard work and he forgot the meaning of respect. He looked at my age and he saw an opportunity. He looked at my love and he saw a weakness, but I did not let him destroy what we built. I took the knife and I cut the cancer out. It was a painful surgery, but the infection is gone. Our legacy is safe and the rot has been removed forever. I felt a profound sense of peace settle over my shoulders. For years, I had carried the heavy burden of watching my son become a man I did not respect. I had enabled him, funded his mistakes, and silently endured his condescending attitude because I thought that was what a father was supposed to do. But standing there in the cemetery, I realized my true duty was to protect the integrity of the life Vivian and I had built. I had done exactly that. I touched the cold marble of the headstone one last time. I promised her I would live the rest of my days on my own terms. Then I turned and walked back to my truck. I drove to the West Loop. I had officially sold the main block of commercial warehouses to the Silicon Valley tech firm for $12 million. The digital funds were sitting safely inside the Vivian Caldwell Irrevocable Trust. But I did not sell everything. I had kept the original brick workshop tucked away in the alley where I first started my business 40 years ago. I pulled the truck up to the heavy metal garage doors and walked inside. The space was massive and smelled wonderfully of sawdust motor oil and welding fumes. It did not look like a retirement home. It looked like a place where things were built to last. Elias was sitting at a heavy wooden workbench polishing a collection of steel wrenches. When he saw me walk in, he put the tools down and stood up. A wide, genuine smile broke across his face. A few seconds later, the rest of my old construction crew emerged from the back office. These were the men who had poured concrete and laid brick with me for decades. They were rough, calloused men who understood the value of loyalty and hard work. They were not my blood, but they were my true family. I walked over to the workbench and picked up a heavy steel wrench, feeling the cold metal in my palm. I was not a lonely old man sitting in a dark house waiting for the end. I was surrounded by men I trusted with my life. I had my workshop, my tools, and my absolute freedom. But I was not just going to spend my days tinkering with old engines. The terrible days I spent locked inside the Pine Haven Memory Care Ward had opened my eyes to a dark reality. I had seen the other elderly patients wandering the halls, heavily sedated and entirely forgotten by the world. I knew that thousands of older people were sitting in those facilities right now being quietly robbed and abused by greedy relatives who thought nobody was watching. I had called Marcus Vance earlier that week and directed him to pull $5 million from the trust fund. We established a massive legal foundation dedicated exclusively to protecting elderly victims of financial abuse and medical fraud. The Caldwell Foundation hired a fleet of ruthless corporate attorneys, private investigators, and forensic accountants. Their only job was to hunt down predatory family members and corrupt nursing home administrators. We set up an anonymous hotline for nurses and facility staff to report suspicious activity. When the foundation found a parasite bleeding an old man or woman dry, Marcus and his team would descend on them with the full, devastating force of the federal court system. We were taking the exact trap I had built for my son and deploying it across the entire state. I put the steel wrench back on the workbench and looked around the shop. The afternoon sun was streaming through the high, dirty windows, catching the dust in the air. I felt strong. I felt awake. My mind was sharper than it had ever been. The world looks at a 75-year-old man and sees a fading shadow. They see a slowing step and gray hair, and they assume the fire has gone out. Kendrick and Brooke made that exact same mistake. They thought my silence was weakness. They thought my age was a surrender. They forgot one thing: an old mechanic knows exactly how to dismantle a machine piece by piece until there is nothing left. I am 75 years old, and my life has just begun. The greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that blood does not automatically grant someone the right to your life or your legacy. We often mistake enabling our children for loving them. By constantly smoothing out Kendrick's path and paying for his mistakes, I thought I was being a good father. Instead, I was feeding a parasite that eventually tried to consume me. Family is built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine loyalty, not just shared genetics and financial entitlement. You must never allow your love for someone to become the weapon they use to destroy you. Sometimes the most profound act of self-preservation is knowing when to close the door on the people you raised. If you believe that respect is more important than blood, let me know your thoughts in the comments below and hit the subscribe button for more stories of survival and justice.